Restoring the power of unions. Restoring the power of unions. It takes a movement. Julius G. Getman. New Haven. To Vinnie Cirabella. Contents. Preface. Lessons from Life, v. Acknowledgements, XV. Introduction, 1. Part 1 Overview 1 The Need for Unions, 9.2 The Fall of Organized Labor. A Brief Overview, 16.3 The NLRA Organizing Process, 23. Part 2 The Story of Unite Here for Here and Its History, 35.5 The Rejuvenation of Here Local 2, 53.6 Organizing Yale's Clerical and Technical Workers, 67 The Need for a New Organizing Model, 72.8 The Culinary Union and the Development of the Comprehensive Campaign, 79. 9 From Hanley to Wilhelm, 92.10 Refining the Comprehensive Campaign, 101.11 The Immigration Issue, 115.12 Here in the 21st Century, 120.13 Solidarity Rebuffed, 138. Part 3 Why the NLRB election process doesn't work for unions 14 The Problem of Access, 179.15 The Regulation of Employer Campaign Conduct, 191.16 The Duty to Bargain and the Protection of Employee Choice, 199.17 NLRA Organizing, Law and Reality, 202. Part 4 The Strike Weapon 18 Restructuring the Strike Weapon, 221.19 Strikes, Picketing, Comprehensive Campaigns, and the Law, 229.20 Comprehensive Campaigns and RICO, 242. Part 5 The Need to Change the Law 21 Organized Labor and the Employee Free Choice Act, 257.22 Changing the Law of Representation Campaigns and Striker Replacement, 268.23 Is the NLRA worth saving? 275.24 Beyond Traditional Collective Bargaining, 288. Part 6 Summing up 25 The Difference between Labor Organization and Labor Movement, 305. Conclusion, 325. Notes, 327. Index, 367. Preface. Lessons from Life. The son of a garment industry cutter, I grew up with the knowledge that we were union people. Although I knew little about the complexities of labor relations and collective bargaining, I knew that the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGWU, had provided what little schooling my immigrant father ever got. It helped him earn decent wages, and the benefits that it provided included home visits by Dr. Lamstein for $2. It was not until I attended Harvard Law School and studied labor law with the noted scholar Archibald Cox that I began to understand how complex the issues of labor law and labor relations were. Cox, like most of the Harvard faculty, discouraged emotional commitment and emphasized rigorous legal analysis. He did not care whether a particular opinion helped or hurt unions. Instead, he would ask, was it consistent with statutory language, policy, and history? Did it follow established precedent? Cox was rigorous, stately, nonpartisan, knowledgeable, the model of an impartial expert, labor arbitrator, and mediator trusted by both unions and management. I realized in his Class V that my earlier views had been one-sided and uninformed. By the time I graduated, my goal was to become like Cox, a labor expert above the fray. I soon got my chance. After graduation from law school, I went to work for the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB. It was a great place to work. The attorneys with whom I worked were dedicated and able. Many went on to distinguished academic and government careers. I thought them as tough and impartial as sheriffs in Western movies. They were neutral labor law experts, like Archibald Cox. When I left the board to enter law teaching, I was determined to carry on this tradition of neutral expertise. My first labor law students at Indiana University wondered whether I was pro-union or pro-management. My first scholarly article was a complex exposition and criticism of the Midwest Piping Doctrine, which required an employer to withhold recognition from either of two competing unions. I argued that the doctrine did not protect employees and that it unnecessarily hindered employers. My article was carefully reasoned and researched. It betrayed no partisan bias. It supported changes in a technical labor law issue that nobody really cared about. My first connection with the labor movement and the realities of labor law occurred in the fall of 1965 when I was asked to teach labor law to a group of steelworkers who had been selected for academic potential from among hundreds of applicants. The program that brought them to campus was an experiment jointly developed by the United Steelworkers, Indiana University, and the Ford Foundation. The fellows chosen studied a full range of academic subjects, including English literature, political science, speech, and history, in addition to labor law. Once on campus, they had the time of their lives. They eagerly read the assigned material and held heated debates about its significance. After class hours they could be found arguing the merits of unions with the conservative business students with whom they shared dormitory space. I realized after a few weeks that I was learning a lot about industrial regulations from their questions. The fellows teased each other constantly and after a while began to tease me, focusing mainly on the irrationality of the law, much of which made no sense to them. They were not a group easily cowed by credentials, not mine and not any of the other faculty who taught in the program. I admired their eagerness to learn and envied their evident sense of commitment to the union and to each other. Their solidarity and devotion to the union made me less satisfied with my above-the-phrase style of teaching and scholarship. At the end of the graduation ceremony that marked the program's end, they locked arms and sang, "Solidarity Forever," several with tears in their eyes. The fellows returned to their mills and factories, inspired and eager to repay the union for its support. But many soon became disillusioned. They had expected recognition of their learning and the opportunity to play a prominent role in their local unions using the skills that they had acquired at the university. But instead of new respect, they were met with resentment. The union's professional staff worried that their role was being preempted and their status undercut by the willingness of the fellows to state contrary opinions. The fellows quickly came to be resented as wise asses and know-it-alls. The resentment on both sides became strong enough that several of the fellows began exploring new career paths and the union's district leadership demanded the right to name the fellows for the next year's program. This was my first, but far from last, encounter with the harmful effects of internal union political battles on the goals and performance of organized labor. When the program ended, I was asked to teach at a leadership training program for leading members of Steelworkers District 30's staff, including the district director. I accepted immediately. I was eager to demonstrate my pedagogic skill to this important union group. The class, however, was a fiasco. Unlike the fellows, the staff members did not appreciate Socratic questioning. They were uncomfortable when I asked them to suggest answers to difficult issues. Worst of all, they overwhelmingly deferred to positions taken by their superiors in the union's hierarchy. Speaking truth to power was not part of their agenda. The district director himself answered a few of my questions, but when I prompted him for his reasoning, he simply restated his conclusions. It was, I realized, as hierarchical as the army in which I had served as an enlisted man. From time to time during the 1960s, I served as a labor arbitrator. Arbitrators are private judges hired by employers and unions to interpret their agreement when disputes arise. They decide whether management has just cause to discharge workers, whether seniority is being properly acknowledged in promotions, and whether employees are being laid off, given vacation time, or paid in accordance with the agreement. What I learned as an arbitrator is how profoundly collective bargaining agreements change the nature of the employment relationship. Collective bargaining, when it works properly, gives unions status and workers dignity. In the late 1960s I also became active in the American Association of University Professors, AAUP, which had a large and active chapter on campus. The AAUP, although it neither engaged in nor advocated collective bargaining for professors, was as close to a union as faculty at major universities came in those days. Tenacious, and quite effective in promoting its major causes, academic freedom and faculty governance. The concept of academic freedom had been developed and defended by the AAUP in the aftermath of World War I. A team of major scholars had given the term practical meaning through a complex process that involved censuring universities that violated the rights of faculty members to teach, study, and publish the truth as they saw it. University administrators were eager to avoid censure by the AAUP on issues of academic freedom, and they wanted the goodwill of the local chapter because it was highly respected by the faculty, had access to the press, and could initiate the process of investigation and censure. In 1969, with Professor Stephen B. Goldberg of the University of Illinois, I undertook to write a treatise on the law of union organizing. Organizing campaigns were then, as they are now, an area of complex legal regulation. Goldberg and I quickly realized that we did not know enough to properly evaluate the rationality of existing law. In a moment of academic daring facilitated by ignorance, we decided to investigate the relationship between the law and the realities of union organizing campaigns. It took us 4 years and 6 test studies to develop our research design. We wanted to identify elections likely to involve hard-fought, possibly illegal election campaigns by employers and their lawyers and consultants. Much to our surprise, the NLRB, where we both had worked and which regularly stressed the desirability of academic inquiry into board rules, opposed our study. The board argued that employees would be intimidated by our presence and that they would assume that we were employer spies and either refuse to talk to us or not tell us the truth. The board's concern with the effect of our presence was based on assumptions very similar to those that the board used in regulating campaign conduct, namely, that employees were attuned to nuances of coercion and could in fact be easily coerced into voting against union representation. To get the names of the employees eligible to vote in the elections we wished to study, we were forced to sue the NLRB under the newly enacted Freedom of Information Act. We were the first of many academics to use the act in support of our research and were rewarded with a strong favorable opinion by Judge J. Skelly Wright. 1. From the first test study, our experience talking to workers was far different from the board's prediction in almost every way. The employees answered honestly and fully. They had things to say about their jobs, their employers, and the unions that sought to organize them. They were pleased that we were genuinely interested. Indeed, it is difficult to overstate their eagerness to help make the law fairer generally. Our data further undermined my belief in the board's expertise. What we concluded is that NLRB rules about what employers may say do not reflect an understanding of employee voting behavior. This conclusion, which I still believe to be true, has been questioned by many subsequent scholars. I explain in Chapter 17 why I believe that subsequent research purporting to undermine our results is untrustworthy. Quite apart from the careful statistical analysis of NLRB rules, I came away with a sense of the decency and intelligence of the workers whom we talked with. I also concluded sadly that the union organizers whose campaigns we studied, although invariably decent people, were often incompetent. They relied too much on canned handouts and did not spend enough time talking to and listening to the workers they were attempting to organize. In our book Union Representation Elections, Law and Reality, we recommended less regulation of employer speech and greater access to employees for union organizers. Our study made something of a stir, but it was sharply criticized by union lawyers and pro-union academics who insisted that employer rhetoric required far more regulation than we suggested. I joined the Yale Law faculty in 1977. About a year after I arrived, I received a call from the police union, which was seeking a lawyer to help with its upcoming negotiations with the state. I agreed to meet with members of the union's bargaining committee at the bar of the Sheraton Hotel. When I arrived, I had no trouble picking out the members of the police union even though they were out of uniform, leather jackets, bright sports coats, and shirts opened at the throat. Their manner was boisterous. Despite the laughter and drinks, their posture suggested wariness rather than relaxation. They told me about their union, which had only recently been organized when the troopers had become dissatisfied with the traditional role of the Policemen's Benevolent Association. They had negotiated a contract once before, but the troopers remained discontented. The department was rife with favoritism. Assignments were based on getting along rather than on ability. Police were punished unfairly on the basis of unproven allegations. Senior members of the force were denied legitimate opportunity. No career ladder existed, and training was inadequate. The police were subject to arbitrary discipline. The police auxiliaries they had to work with were a joke and a menace. Each accusation was illustrated with stories that brought forth knowing laughter and expressions of anger. The officers of the union wanted me to draft proposals and actually conduct the negotiations on their behalf. The offer was tempting. Delightful way to learn both about police and about the intricacies of collective bargaining, a subject that I had taught but something that I had never engaged in. Also, the group was surprisingly appealing with their camaraderie, toughness, and cynical humor. I spent at least a day each week during the next few months meeting with the troopers and learning about their jobs, concerns, and attitudes. I got a sense of how the world looked from the vantage point of those compelled to deal with human beings at their worst and to confront violent death, tragedy, hostility, and deception on a regular basis. They saw themselves as guardians of a society that did not appreciate them and as workers for a government that underpaid, scorned, and regularly mistreated them. The negotiations proceeded slowly. The hardest part for me was not the discussions across the table but the free-for-all battles that occurred during the union caucuses when it was time to make concessions. It was during the caucuses that I earned my money and really learned about the art of compromise. But despite the tension in the bargaining committee, the state made a series of important concessions so that after a month of negotiations the outline of a fine contract had been agreed to. The cops were pleased and attributed far more of the success to my tough negotiating style than I deserved. It was their anger and militancy that worried the state negotiator, not my eloquence. After a month of meetings, negotiations stalled. The cops, without my involvement, decided on a job action, one that had no precedent. During the weekend before the July 4th holiday, they stopped issuing tickets to motorists. They didn't stop patrolling. They arrested drunk drivers, and they continued to stop speeders, whom they warned to slow down. But the delighted motorists were let go with a verbal warning. It was a responsible job action, and the newspapers mostly pointed this out in their editorials. Theoretically, the cops who weren't issuing tickets were subject to discipline, but the sergeants and lieutenants never issued a single reprimand. After 2 days I got a frantic call from the state's lawyer, who desperately wanted an agreement before the July 4th weekend. We met the following Monday and quickly came to an agreement. I learned a lot during that negotiation. Most significantly, that the strike or strike threat is a powerful weapon. Second, that imaginative job actions can sometimes be as effective as strikes. And third, that a union can gain more power when it has low-level supervisors on its side. While at Yale, I was invited to spend a week at the Polish Academy for State and Law. I accepted eagerly because I knew that the country was being profoundly changed by the Solidarity labor movement. While in Poland, I met with many of the movement's leaders. I was particularly struck by the former factory worker Zbigniew Budziak and his close relationship with the dissident intellectual Jan Latyński. I realized that the alliance between workers and intellectuals mediated by the Catholic Church was what gave Solidarity its admirable vision. When I returned to Yale, I saw that the worker-intellectual alliance that I so admired in Poland existed in Local 34 of the Hotel Employees and Restaurant Employees International Union, here, which was seeking to organize Yale clerical and technical workers. The alliance was marvelous, illustrated in the relationship between the 9th grade dropout Vincent Cirabella and his disciple, John Wilhelm, an honors graduate of Yale. I conducted a series of interviews with them and published an article about what I thought of as their inside-outside approach to organizing and collective bargaining. The organizing drive was dramatic and very well led. It was followed by an equally dramatic strike that ended in a surprising union victory. I spoke out on behalf of the union and conducted a series of interviews with its leaders. I became convinced that they were onto something valuable for the labor movement generally. When I left Yale and joined the faculty at the University of Texas, I continued to study the organizing efforts of HERE, then directed by Cirabella. The book on union organizing that I was planning to write was placed on hold in the 1990s as I turned my scholarly attention to the issue of strike replacement. It all began innocently enough when a former student, James Brudney, then staff counsel to the Senate Labor Committee, asked me to testify on proposed legislation that made it unlawful for an employer to hire permanent strike replacements. During the hearing I began talking with a group of permanently replaced paperworkers from Maine. Their story moved me, and I decided to find out more about the strike. This led to a 10-year study of the strike of Local 14 of the United Paperworkers International Union, UPIU, which represented workers at International Paper's Androscoggin Mill in Maine. During the course of the 16-month strike, Local 14 used a version of the inside-outside strategies previously employed by HERE. The local had superb leadership, widespread grassroots involvement, and highly creative strategies. It also had inspiring solidarity. Fewer than 70 of the 1,200 strikers crossed the picket line. Local 14 also won over the media and enlisted the support of national political figures. Despite Local 14's heroic struggle, the strike was unconditionally called off in October 1988. The local has since been decertified and the community destroyed. Two things about the union's loss were particularly disheartening. First, the International Union's leadership mishandled the strike. Many were hostile to the local's leadership and their outside advisors. Some seemed worried that the local leaders, who were heroes to the union's rank and file, would try to take over the unions. The other disheartening aspect of the strike was the unfairness of the National Labor Relations Act, which was, according to its preamble, designed to enhance collective bargaining. Collective bargaining can work effectively only if there is a robust right to strike. Since the mid-1980s, the union movement has been in a precarious situation. It has been confronted by increasingly hostile employers. Union jobs have moved overseas. Under the malevolently anti-union Bush Labor Board and the conservative courts, the law has grown dramatically more hostile. Unions have been sued under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, and state tort law. They have been burdened with new reporting requirements, and their political efforts have been restricted. Inevitably, the once powerful union pay advantage has shrunk. Major organizing efforts by once powerful unions like the United Auto Workers and the United Mine Workers have failed. But HERE, the union that organized Yale workers during the late 1980s and through the 1990s, developed a new and powerful approach to organizing and bargaining that depended on mobilizing the passion of its rank and file membership. Other unions seemed to be experimenting with new approaches as well. It was with the hope that organized labor was becoming more effective and that the mood of the country might be right for union growth that I undertook to write this book. Many thanks to all the people who agreed to be interviewed for this book. I hope I have done justice to your experience and ideas. The basic idea for this book originated in a series of interviews conducted between 1985 and 1995 with Vincent Cirabella, who for most of that time was Director of Organizing for the Hotel Employees in Restaurant Employees Union, HERE. Vinny's first disciple was John Wilhelm, now president of Unite Here, whom I first saw in action and came to admire during the organizing drive of Yale's clerical and technical workers. During the writing of this book, John was steadfast in his encouragement, support, and friendship. My research for this book brought me into contact with the legendary union strategist Jeff Fiedler, the guru of the comprehensive campaign. He was enormously helpful by providing ideas, information, insights, and humor. Another grateful nod to the paperworkers of J, Maine, and their families. Their story is relevant to the basic concept of this book, the need for organized labor to become a movement once again. Peter Kellman and Roland Sampson were especially helpful. Acknowledgements XV. I had many conversations with Judy Scott, the able and innovative General Counsel of SEIU. I am thankful for her help and her friendship. She was consistently willing to share ideas and explain strategy. Kirk Adams and Tom Woodruff, SEIU's insightful organizing leaders, were gracious and helpful. I am grateful to Andy Stern and Anna Berger, SEIU's top leaders, for taking the time to speak with me. They made me aware of the union's multifaceted approach to organizing and collective bargaining. It was particularly gratifying, 20 years after the Yale clerical and maintenance strike, to renew contact with Paul Clifford, Andrea Van Den Heever, Carl Lachow, and Warren Heyman. Each played a major role during the strike. I also had the opportunity to interview Sherry Chiesa and D. Taylor, both of whom Vinny Cirabella had brought to my attention as up-and-coming union leaders more than 25 years earlier. They have lived up to his expectations. Chiesa is now Secretary-Treasurer of Unite Here, and Taylor is General Vice President and leader of the Culinary Union in Las Vegas. Richard McCracken, whom I first met as a young lawyer, is now Here's creative legal strategist. He has been the guiding force behind the union's rejection of the NLRB election process. I learned a lot from Donna Schneider and Willie Gonzalez, who are heading Unite Here's fascinating organizing effort in Texas. I am grateful once again to Ray Rogers for telling me about the early days of the corporate campaign. Many people at AFL-CIO were of help, including former President John Sweeney, and then General Counsel John Hyatt. I had several enlightening conversations with Director of Organizing Stuart Acuff. Cecil Roberts, the eloquent president of the UMW, was willing to describe for me in detail the union's efforts to utilize comprehensive campaign tactics. Thanks to organizer Sarah Julian and management attorney Katie Lev, both daughters of former colleagues and both now skilled professionals. I learned much from each of them. My special thanks to Crystal Lee Sutton for speaking to me with her passion and frankness while fatally ill. She remains an inspiration long after the events memorialized in the film Norma Ray. I was fortunate to have excellent labor-experienced student assistants Brooke Learman and Mike Murphy. They and I were supported by student Ryan Lovell. I received excellent, more than customary, support from my faculty assistants Gail Hathcock and Marcia Moyer. Thanks to Associate Dean Michelle Dickerson for providing me with a light teaching load at the start of the project. Everyone that I dealt with at Yale University Press has been competent, interested, and supportive, starting with Mike O'Malley, who first encouraged me to take on another book about labor. Margaret Otzel, a former shop steward for Yale's Local 34, was the ideal in-house editor for this book, and the copy editing by Karen Schoen was splendid. Former Yale Local 34 organizer Aldo Cupo, who worked for the union after the strike, was my production controller at the press. Finally, I'd like to express my longtime scholarly and personal debt to the late Jerome R. Mintz, of Indiana University, a marvelous scholar and writer who has served for many years as an academic model. This page intentionally left blank. Basic concepts. Organized labor needs to rekindle the spirit of the activist member-powered movement that has guided its past successes. Organized labor today is a progressive interest group, but it is not a workers' movement. A movement entails something more than money, members, and economic power, significant though all these factors are. A movement requires activating and using the energies of workers. It means fostering solidarity across unions and occupations. It requires leaders who are willing to trust and who are committed to sharing power with the union's rank and file. The spirit of movement also requires a concern for issues beyond the economic well-being of the members, such as environmental justice, racial equality, and the rights of immigrants. Organized labor regularly approaches this goal and just as regularly retreats from it. This book tells the story of labor's struggles, both external and internal, by tracking the history of the Hotel Employees and Restaurant Employees International Union, HERE. I have chosen here, currently unite here, as my focus because I believe that today it, 1. Introduction. More than any other union, has focused not only on organizing and bargaining but also on creating a spirit of movement. Unfortunately it, like all unions, has been hindered by the law, corruption, and internal strife. As the HERE story illustrates, even with its membership mobilized and alliances established, organized labor would face major obstacles in organizing the unorganized and advancing the well-being of its members. It would still face the opposition of employers and the law's inadequacy, hostility, and complexity. The rules of labor law in every major area give an advantage to employers and make organizing and striking dangerous activities. The law should be amended to give workers greater voice. In this book I consider various proposals for reform, ranging from card-check organizing to eliminating the right of employers to permanently replace striking workers. In the aftermath of the 2008 election, labor leaders spent large sums of money and devoted great resources to passing the Employee Free Choice Act, EFCA, which provides for card-check recognition and mandatory first contract arbitration after impasse. Despite the near unanimity of support for the EFCA from labor leaders and pro-labor scholars, I argue that the focus on EFCA was a mistake and that, even if ultimately passed, it would not achieve the optimistic goals that labor's spokespeople envision. I argue that protecting the right to strike, so that striking workers could not be permanently replaced, would be considerably more valuable and far more in keeping with building a sense of movement. Not all the obstacles to labor's advance come from outside. Internal divisions, some ideological, some political, and others personal, have been a major obstacle to worker solidarity, as HERE's history demonstrates with depressing regularity. Outline of chapters. In Chapter 1 I illustrate why a strong, vital, and progressive labor movement is important for our society, both economically and politically. When unions were strong, the United States had the longest period of equitably shared prosperity in U.S. history, a sharp contrast with our current situation of a weak labor movement and growing economic discontent and gross disparities in wealth. The weakness of organized labor has had a negative impact on our political culture. It has made it relatively easy for right-wing demagogues to shamelessly appropriate the banner of populism and to turn to their own advantage the feelings of working-class people that they are invisible to those in power. In Chapter 2 I explain the decline of the labor movement and why it has failed to organize the unorganized, has lost strikes, and has become more professional but less militant and less inspiring. My explanation places less emphasis on the law and more on the problems inherent in the structure of the current union movement and the attitudes of its leaders. I believe that the labor movement bears more responsibility for its decline than most union leaders, liberal commentators, and scholars have been willing to acknowledge. To demonstrate this point I focus on the law and the practice of organizing. The National Labor Relations Act, NLRA, has provided a system of representation elections for determining whether a group of workers is to be represented by a union. Chapter 3 explains how this election process works in practice. I describe the strategies of the parties and show the hurdles that must be overcome before a union is certified as the bargaining agent for a unit of employees. Chapters 4 to 7 trace the history of HERE from its early days to the mid-1980s. I demonstrate that along the way the union has faced virtually every problem that has confronted the labor movement generally, including corruption, mob infiltration, weak leadership, fear of change, political divisions, racism, sexism, anti-immigrant prejudice, and economic catastrophe. It has successfully overcome its internal problems through a remarkable collaboration between up-from-the-ranks working-class leadership and progressive, college-trained political activists with roots in student and civil rights movements. The collaboration began when Vincent Cirebella, a longtime union dissident who headed the union's local of maintenance workers at Yale, hired and trained John Wilhelm, a Yale graduate and longtime political activist. Together with a remarkable group of organizers and activists, they won a series of victories culminating with the successful organizing campaign and strike by Yale's clerical and technical workers. The Connecticut and Yale locals of HERE in the early 1980s represented a return to a model of collaboration between workers and intellectuals that had been absent from organized labor for many years. Its main architect was Cirebella, whom Ed Hanley selected as the director of organizing for the union. Cirebella believed that the model that he developed at Yale could transform the labor movement, and he began a national organizing campaign, which failed. Chapters 8 to 13 trace the development of corporate and comprehensive campaign techniques by unions generally and HERE in particular. The lessons learned from Vincent Cirebella's failed national organizing campaign have turned out to be a major benefit to HERE. The union has abandoned the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, and instead developed a comprehensive campaign model based on mobilizing workers, forming committees, and pressuring employers to sign neutrality and card-check agreements. I explain why these tactics provide great advantages over the representation election system. HERE and other unions using similar methods have organized successfully during the past decades as a result of these advantages. These chapters also discuss how Heer, under the leadership of John Wilhelm, became a major advocate within the labor movement for the rights of immigrant workers. I also explore why Heer and Unite, the Union of Needle Trades, Industrial and Textile Employees, an amalgamation of garment unions, merged to form Unite Heer. The problem of internal union politics, which this merger illustrates, is one of the major obstacles to recreating a powerful and effective labor movement. It was an understandable merger of two unions with progressive histories and complementary needs and resources. However, the merger resulted in a major battle between Bruce Rayner, the president of Unite, who became the general president of the union after the merger, and John Wilhelm, who became the union's co-president. Wilhelm is now the union's president, and Rayner is no longer affiliated with Unite Heer. The battle was made far more bitter and potentially destructive by the involvement of Andy Stern, the president of the Service Employees International Union, SEIU. Chapters 14 to 17 explain why the NLRA election process has made organizing difficult. That the NLRA election process does not work well for unions is well recognized by commentators and union spokespeople, most of whom focus on unlawful employer resistance and the law system of woefully inadequate remedies. The prohibition against unfair labor practices has done little to deter employers from threatening or retaliating against union supporters. To avoid the harmful impact of illegal employer behavior, unions have focused much effort on the passage of the EFCA. I suggest, on the basis of earlier field studies, that unions and academic commentators have exaggerated the impact of the threats and reprisals. I also argue that they have for too long limited themselves to what is called hot shop organizing. In chapters 18 to 20 I demonstrate why an effective right to strike is critical to the labor movement and why the law, particularly the right of employers to hire permanent replacements, has turned out to be a significant hindrance to labor's effective use of the strike. I show that the secondary boycott laws are both harmful and unconstitutional. I also explore the potentially devastating effect of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act (RICO) on the strength of the strike weapon. In chapters 21 and 22 I discuss the strengths and weaknesses of different proposals to change the NLRA. I suggest that the EFCA is unlikely to provide the great boost to organizing that its proponents look forward to and its opponents dread. I argue that the EFCA would not do away with organizing campaigns in which the employer's advantage in terms of access to employees would remain a critical factor. I also argue that passage of the act would lead many employers to conduct anti-union campaigns earlier than they might otherwise. In these chapters I make the case for amending the NLRA to prohibit employers from hiring permanent replacement workers in place of strikers. The regular use of permanent replacement during the 1980s has made organized labor fearful, with good reason, of striking. In chapters 23 and 24 I consider whether the NLRA, administered by a supposedly expert agency, is a worthwhile scheme or whether it should be scrapped and replaced by a different federal act or by state law. I conclude that the NLRA is worth saving but that it needs a fundamental overhaul. I suggest that board members be chosen from a limited pool of neutral experts, possibly from the National Academy of Arbitrators, and that a special court review board decisions. Among the needed amendments to the NLRA, I argue, are the following. The board's remedial power needs to be increased. Injunctions against employers. Unfair labor practices need to be regularly issued, just as they are currently issued against union secondary boycotts. Unions need to be given equal time to respond to employer speeches and meetings, and the election process should be accelerated. Employees unlawfully fired during an organizing campaign should be quickly reinstated. Most significantly, strikers who engage in no serious misconduct should not be risking their jobs when they lawfully walk out. In Chapter 24 I consider the impact of various alternatives to traditional collective bargaining. A frequently made suggestion is to permit minority bargaining. Several prominent labor scholars believe that the NLRA, properly interpreted, permits minority bargaining. I disagree. I argue that minority bargaining violates the law and that permitting it would not do much to strengthen the labor movement. Chapter 25 focuses on the difference between organized labor and a labor movement. I argue that too often, Union leaders have failed to take needed chances or to accept responsibility for their organizing and bargaining failures. It is possible to organize in the face of employer opposition in a hose. Tile NLRB, as several unions, especially Unite Here, have demonstrated. Fear of failure has made unions too cautious and unwilling to depart from the hotshot model. Taking chances is critical. Indeed, failed efforts such as Here's national organizing drive of the late 1980s have provided the basis for later success. If a man tells you he loves America, yet hates labor, he is a liar. There is no America without labor, and to fleece the one is to rob the other. That is what Abraham Lincoln said. It is not surprising that the man who spoke eloquently of government of, by, and for the people believed in the cause of labor, for the two are inevitably intertwined. When organized labor is strong, workers become visible to those in power. A strong labor movement also assures those who toil a fair share of the wealth that they help produce. That is why the cause of labor is worth fighting for and why its failures are often failures of the American ideal. Given the enormous power of corporations and corporate executives, the need for a powerful voice for labor is greater today than it has ever been. Yet organized labor is in a state of crisis. Its percentage of the working force has shrunk. 1. It is besieged by enemies, critics, and self-appointed saviors. Many believe that the day of unions has come and gone. Some believe that they are outdated, rendered unnecessary by legislation and useless by globalization, employer opposition, and the relentless working of the market. Some explain the denying. Chapter 1: The Need for Unions. Clinging role of unions is the result of failures, weaknesses, and misdeeds, violence, prejudice, corruption, and indifference to the interests of workers. Some applaud the demise of unions because their absence gives the market a chance to work without interference. 2. But for workers, the unregulated market is a disaster zone. As organized labor has struggled for survival, workers and their families have seen their standard of living decline, maintaining their real income only by making the wage earner family a thing of the past. 3. Finally, in the wake of populist outrage, sympathetic interest in unions is increasing, fueled by the inescapable facts of corporate plundering, widespread economic distress, the gross and growing inequality between workers and executives, 4. In the realization that millions of working people are only one medical crisis from financial disaster. 5. Progressive economists have long pointed out that unions bring needed balance to the distribution of economic benefits, that they improve wages for workers throughout the economy, and that they make the entire economy stronger. The traditional role of unions was explained by Paul Krugman in his book The Conscience of a Liberal. Unions were once an important factor limiting income inequality, both because of their direct effect in raising their members' wages and because the union pattern of wage settlements, which consistently raised the wages of less well-paid workers more, was, in the 50s and 60s, reflected in the labor market as a whole. The decline of the unions has removed that moderating influence. 6. The wage benefit to workers of unionization has been conservatively estimated as around 15%. In addition, as Michael Yates has pointed out, the compensation advantage, which includes the benefits, is greater than the wage advantage. This is because union members enjoy both more and better fringe benefits than do non-union workers. The union advantage is greater for blue-collar workers than for all workers, reflecting the fact that unions are of most benefit to workers of lower status. 7. There are those who believe that productivity suffers when employers must pay higher wages and are forced to give up their discretion to discharge and promote at will. This argument has been refuted by a series of economic studies, recently summed up by Lawrence Michel, the president of the Economic Policy Institute. Decades of research show that unions can have substantial positive effects on firm performance. At least 4 factors account for the positive impact on performance. 1. Unions give employees a voice in the workplace, allowing them to complain, shape operations, and push for change, rather than simply quitting or being fired. 2. Union employees feel freer to speak up about operations, leading to improvements that increase productivity. 3. Higher pay pushes employers to find other ways to lower costs, with new technology, increased investment, and better management. 4. Union employees get more training, both because they demand it and because management is willing to invest more to get a return on their higher pay. 8. The strength or weakness of organized labor also affects public policy generally. As the noted labor economist Harley Shaken has pointed out, the decline of the labor movement exacerbates income inequality not only directly but also because it diminishes the role of unions in shaping public policy. For example, partly as a result of labor's diminished clout, an increase in the minimum wage has been blocked in recent years. Tax policy, to take a second example, has favored the rich, leading to smaller revenues to invest in health care, education, and other public programs that benefit the middle class. A stronger labor movement would have produced different tax and spending policies. 9. Unions play an important role in bringing out underlying progressive attitudes among their members. Through political education they explain to workers the significance of public policy choices. And union leaders like Cecil Roberts of the United Mine Workers of America and Maria Elena Durazo, head of the Los Angeles County Federation of Labor, are effective in shifting attitudes and getting workers to the polls. They are trusted by workers because of their history of battling on behalf of the underprivileged, and they speak in a voice that workers can easily relate to. In recent years, unions have been very effective in getting their members to vote. In 2000, 2004, and 2006, a high percentage of union members voted, and they voted overwhelmingly for Democrats. 10 People with similar backgrounds and income who were not members of a union were far more likely to vote Republican. If organized labor had more members, George Bush would not have been in a position to claim victory in 2000, and he would have lost to John Kerry in 2004. 11 The labor movement played a key role in Barack Obama's victory in 2008. The political contributions of organized labor have a long and distinguished history. As Paul Krugman noted, not only did unions provide a reliable source of campaign finance, they provided Democrats with a standing army of campaign workers who distributed lawn signs, bumper stickers, and campaign literature, engaged in door-to-door canvassing, and mobilized for get-out-the-vote efforts on Election Day. A more subtle but probably equally crucial consequence of a powerful union movement was its effect on the political awareness and voter participation rates of lower and middle-income Americans. 12. Union leaders have long played a key role in responding to right-wing extremists who use populist clichés, a phenomenon that currently pervades our political discourse. 13. Although organized labor for many years included unions that discriminated on the basis of race and sex, activist unions played a key role in the passage of civil rights legislation, including both the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Walter Reuther marched with Martin Luther King Jr. and shared the podium with him when King delivered his famous, "I Have a Dream" speech. 14. Unions have made and continue to make a significant contribution to racial harmony among the different ethnic strains of the working poor. It was through the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGWU, that poor immigrant Jews and Italians learned to work and battle together for their mutual benefit. Today in Las Vegas, the Culinary Workers Union effectively joins together Black and Hispanic, African and Caribbean, Anglo and immigrant workers. Here's Local 6 has one of the longest and most distinguished records of battling for equality of any organization in the country. Not only did it join together all of New York's diverse working-class minority groups, but, when it won its first contract in 1939, it included one of the first non-discrimination clauses in U.S. employment history. It forbade any discrimination based on race, ethnicity, or religion. 15 In the 1940s, the union was also successful in equalizing the wages between waiters and waitresses. In the 1950s, Local 6 gave great support to the Little Rock Nine, the students who integrated Little Rock Central High School. Elizabeth Eckford, one of the group, was the niece of Scotty Eckford, then the recording secretary of Local 6. When Ernest Green and several other members of the group were denied jobs during the summer, Local 6 and the ILGWU, now part of Unite Here, found summer jobs in New York for Green and several of the other Little Rock students. Local 6 also led the battle for pay equity between women and men, raising it as a negotiating issue, filing a grievance about it and finally bringing a lawsuit which was settled by an agreement to pay maids the same as housemen. 16. Michael Yates points out, again and again, when workers are asked why they support the union or what the union has meant to them, they say that their fight for a union was a fight for dignity and respect. In scholarly language, what a union does is give workers a voice in their workplaces, a way to put themselves on a more equal footing with their employers. 17. It is the collective bargaining process augmented by a grievance system, the final step of which is a decision by a neutral party, that regularly redeems the promise of dignity. At the unorganized workplace, employees' rights against the employer are severely limited and in many areas non-existent. Employers have the right to hire and fire largely at will. They have almost unlimited discretion in structuring and altering job structures. Workers have almost no defense against management demands, no matter how unfair or ill-conceived. 18. Management determines what is to be done, how it is to be done, when it is to be done, and what constitutes success or failure. It can punish failure by any means it chooses, up to and including discharge. Management decides what to pay for particular jobs and can cut wages or increase hours. It can regulate hours, determine holidays, and decide whom to lay off during periods of downturn. To be sure, employer discretion is limited by the market, but the market dictates that workers be paid as little as possible and that their benefits be limited in order to increase profits. The market provides no protection against layoff during periods of downturn, nor does it ensure that workers will get a fair share of the profits when things are going well. As I once heard former Labor Secretary George Shultz say, when it comes to labor relations the market is all thumbs. 19. It is the largely unregulated market that has kept worker income static while executive salaries have soared. It is of course true that under the law, management discretion is not absolute. The Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, sets limits on hours and requires overtime pay for non-supervisory employees. The anti-discrimination laws require that hiring and firing be done without regard to race, gender, religion, or national origin, and the NLRA prohibits employers from punishing employees for engaging in protected concerted activity, including protesting against working conditions and providing support for unions. The difficulty with these laws is twofold. Their scope is fairly limited and enforcement mechanisms are inadequate. An employee who is fired because he or she protests an employer's policy is unlikely to get that job back even if the firing is ultimately held by the labor board to be unlawful, something that rarely happens. Where collective bargaining between a responsible union and a law-abiding employer occurs, the result is likely to be a workplace in which power is to a significant degree shared. Collective bargaining agreements are instruments of change. They replace discretion with rules of the shop. They contain a series of promises by the employer to abide by agreed-upon rules in dealing with the union. In return for a union promise not to strike, employers make a series of important promises about promotions, layoffs, discharges, work schedules, and vacations, among other things. As pointed out by Lawrence Mischel, in our workplaces, unions promote opportunity, security, and fundamental fairness. Through training programs and requirements that job openings be posted and filled fairly, unions help working Americans enjoy a fair chance to get ahead. Unions make sure that workers are rewarded for their years of service and have regular hours that allow them to plan ahead and spend time with their families. Union employers are less likely to violate civil rights laws, less likely to violate minimum wage and overtime laws, and more likely to follow workplace safety standards. 28% of coal miners, for example, work in union mines. Yet from 2004 to 2006, only 14% of fatalities occurred in union mines. The odds of dying in a non-union mine were more than twice as great as in a union mine. 20. Collective bargaining agreements typically cover wages and working conditions for a period of several years. They are therefore generally lengthy, complex, and ambiguous. When an employee or the union believes that rights under an agreement have been violated, a grievance may be filed. Once filed, the grievance is handled by the union through shop stewards and the grievance committee. If pursued, it is dealt with by successively higher levels of management in consultation with their union counterparts. At each stage, management may affirm its original decision, grant the grievance, or offer to grant it in part. At any stage, the union may withdraw the grievance or accept a compromise. If the grievance is not resolved through negotiation, the union has the option of demanding arbitration. A significant number of arbitration cases deal with the propriety of discipline or discharge. To enhance its chances of winning at arbitration, a company needs to establish careful disciplinary procedures consistent with arbitration awards defining the concept of just cause. Arbitrators generally insist on equal punishment for the same offense, and they require that employees be given advance notice of company rules and a chance to explain their behavior before they are disciplined. This increases the need for a sophisticated labor relations staff that will respond appropriately to arbitration decisions and creates a disincentive to dealing with infractions on an ad hoc basis. This is not to say that unions are always an unalloyed blessing for workers. Unions sometimes make life more difficult, sometimes for individuals and sometimes and in some ways for the workforce generally. Because unions almost invariably favor tying benefits and promotions to seniority, they limit opportunities for junior employees. Employees are generally required under union agreements to pay the costs of union representation. Unions also bring the danger of striking, which I discuss in later chapters. But the overwhelming majority of unionized workers believe that the costs and dangers are outweighed by the gains in money, retirement benefits, and workplace dignity. 21. 16. In 1964, in the conservative heartland state of Indiana, the power of organized labor was at, or near, an all-time high. Union members made up nearly half the workforce. The legislature had more union officials than lawyers or lobbyists. The state's major industry was steel, and the United Steelworkers had a major voice in the day-to-day operation of the mills. Union stewards had status comparable to that of management officials, as did business agents of the carpenters, sheet metal workers, and electricians at building sites throughout the state. Dallas Sells, an official of the United Auto Workers and head of the State Federation of Labor, was regularly quoted in the papers, even on issues far removed from strikes and organizing. Union officials served on the boards of public and charitable institutions, and they had constant access to the governor and to major political figures. Indiana University I had a large labor education program, which was controlled by a board of advisors that included university administrators and top union officials. The state's attorney general issued an opinion holding that a form of collective bargaining was permissible for state agencies. Collective bargaining agreements shaped the salaries and benefits of union and non-union workers alike. 2. Chapter 2: The Fall of Organized Labor. A brief overview. Indiana was far from unique. From the Northeast to the Midwest and along the Pacific coast, unions were powerful and seemingly secure. They had reached a state of general acceptance and no longer considered themselves to be under serious attack from management. Unions frequently acted to support their industries. They helped employers get tax breaks and promoted the products that they manufactured. Top union leaders rejected notions of class struggle, which was thought to be a relic of a bygone era. According to Vincent Cirabella of Here, it was common for labor leaders in the 50s, the 60s, and even into the early 70s to say that the major battles with management were over, that the labor movement had arrived, that management respected and accepted us, and all we needed to do was cooperate with them. 3. The smugness of that era is long gone. Unions today have far fewer members and far less power. 4. They are under constant attack from employers, courts, and commentators. In many places they are fighting for survival. 5. The labor movement has been hurt by major changes in the U.S. economy. The decline in U.S. manufacturing in key industries, steel, autos, apparel, cost hundreds of thousands of union jobs. 6. But the loss of manufacturing jobs is only part of the story. The economy kept growing, adding new jobs, particularly in construction, transportation, and service industries. Unions failed to organize successfully in those growing areas of the economy, and their share of the manufacturing sector declined. Why did they fail? Conservative economists argued that private sector unions were no longer relevant in the new economy, that they harmed the economy and did not bring significant gains to workers. According to Leo Troy, the twilight of the old unionism is rooted in Schumpeter's theory of creative destruction and the new age of Adam Smith. Capitalism and free markets spawn trade unions, but as these business processes evolve, trade unions have not kept pace. 7. This statement was written in 2004, and Troy, like many economists, believed that the forces set in motion by the new age of Adam Smith were bound to intensify and force what he called the old unionism deeper into the twilight zone. But the faith in unrestricted business reflected in Troy's statement has in the few years since he wrote those words largely disappeared, even among economists. Today, far fewer people accept the idea that business processes have evolved in a way that makes resistance to its goals and processes unnecessary and undesirable. People are searching once again for ways to control the predatory practices of corporate leaders, and unions are the one group with a record of having done this successfully. Liberal economists and union supporters blame the decline of unions on a combination of employer hostility and the law's inadequacy. According to Nobel laureate Paul Krugman, the answer is simple and brutal. Business interests, which seem to have reached an accommodation with the labor movement in the 1960s, went on the offensive against unions beginning in the 1970s. And we're not talking about gentle persuasion. We're talking about hardball tactics, often including the illegal firing of workers who tried to organize or supported union activity. During the late 70s and early 80s, at least 1 in every 20 workers who voted for a union was illegally fired. Some estimates put the number as high as 1 in 8. A similar point has been made by Dorothy Benz. The reason this union decline is in significant measure the result of U.S. labor law, and in particular its inability to guarantee the right to organize it proclaims on paper. There is widespread agreement in labor and academic circles alike about the failure of the law to protect the right to organize, and there are numerous studies and countless examples documenting the role of weak labor laws in encouraging virulent anti-union campaigns, both legal and illegal, by employers. Particularly problematic are NLRB policies that allow employers to wage no-holds-barred anti-union campaigns. 9. Management opposition has played a big role in thwarting unions. In the public sector, where management has remained neutral, unions have fared much better and now represent somewhere around 35% of eligible workers. Also, since the 1980s, polls have consistently shown that a far higher percentage of workers favor unionization than the percentage unionized. But attributing the failure to organize solely to management opposition and illegality is a simple and comforting explanation for a complex process. Unions bear significant responsibility for their own demise. When the need for organizing new members arose, they were not ready. They did not heed the warning voices from their own ranks urging them to prepare. During the 1960s and 1970s, unions focused their activity and resources on serving their existing membership through collective bargaining, contract enforcement, and a range of supplementary services. Collective bargaining is interesting, exciting, and obviously meaningful. During the days of union power, each agreement was generally a small triumph that produced higher wages, better health care, more free time, more benefits for family members. For most union staff, handling grievances was effective, satisfying work. They were directly responsible for making sure that members received the benefits of the negotiated contracts. When members were unfairly discharged, the union could generally get them returned to work. In carrying out their assignments, union staff did not need passionate member involvement, did not expect it, and generally did not seek it. Nor were union members generally eager to take on serious responsibilities in addition to their regular work. It was a system of professional service that met the goals of both union staffs and union members. The trend toward professionalism in unions was given additional impetus by the complexity of legal regulation in both organizing and bargaining. The technical role of union representative or business agent served to separate the staff from the membership. As said by Daisy Rooks, under the direction of professional staff, many unions often ceased to be militant, class-based social movements. Instead, many evolved into reactive and often stagnant service-providing institutions. 10. The shift in focus from organizing to servicing is understandable and consistent with union democracy. Nevertheless, the leadership of organized labor was blameworthy for losing sight of the need to organize and the need to maintain the spirit of a movement. They ignored warnings from within their own ranks and marginalized those who issued the warnings. They let the interests of the staff take precedence over the goals of the movement. From the 1960s onward, most unions failed to give organizing the high priority that it required. They failed to hire a sufficient number of organizers, and they didn't adequately train those they hired. They routinely assigned their ablest staff members to collective bargaining and those least able to articulate and inspired to organizing. As a result, too many organizers ran unimaginative campaigns in which they relied on dated handouts replete with portraits of a fat, smug, cigar-smoking boss, which had little relevance for workers dealing with young, sophisticated human relations professionals. Poorly run campaigns gave some workers the impression that their opinions did not count, that decisions were made solely by the organizer or by the organizer and a small group of his or her favorites. As John Wilhelm, the president of Unite Here and one of the movement's best organizers, told me in 1985, organizing is not a priority for organized labor. It's not surprising that something that is not a high priority doesn't do very well. It hasn't been a priority in the last 30 years. Even after losses in membership and power were clear, most unions continued to engage in isolated organizing efforts using outdated methods and poorly trained organizers. Through the 1980s, less than 4% of the funds available to unions were devoted to organizing. This is not to ignore the unfortunate contribution of our labor laws to the problems besetting unions. As I discuss in later chapters, the rules governing union representation campaigns give management a major advantage in resisting efforts to organize. The law governing striker replacement regularly makes the right to strike a misnomer. The law dealing with secondary boycotts and organizational picketing seems to make union activity a special disfavored class under the First Amendment. Our laws badly need amendment. Nevertheless, as Wilhelm recognized, unions could have significantly reduced their losses had they focused more effort and imagination on organizing and made a greater effort to mobilize their membership. As Dorothy Benz has explained, for example, The Culinary Workers Union, Local 226 of here, managed to sidestep the labor board and successfully organize in Las Vegas over determined management opposition. The culinary used movement tactics, membership involvement, street and job protests, and where possible alliances. 11. Movements are often nourished by outside attention and support. In the 1930s and 1940s, the labor movement was given great support by intellectuals and artists. Labor's struggles were the subjects of books, dramas, films, articles, and countless stirring songs. The children of New York garment workers and Midwest laborers sang the songs of Appalachian mine workers and believed that they were involved in a common struggle. During the 1960s and 1970s, the one-time powerful alliance between unions and liberal intellectuals began to fade. The rise of the civil rights movement inevitably turned attention away from unions. The successes of the labor movement made the cause of workers seem less compelling. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, radical students, liberals, and some minority leaders began to consider unions with their high salaries and desirable jobs protected by seniority as part of the power structure that perpetuated injustice and inequality. Seniority, once recognized as a major impediment to discrimination, was suddenly perceived as one of the reasons that black workers were last to be hired, first to be fired. Union leaders came to be viewed with suspicion. Many were corrupt. Some unions, like the Teamsters, were gangster-ridden and ready to sell out the interests of the members for the good of the leaders. 12. The divisions between unions and liberal intellectuals were exacerbated by the Vietnam War. Unions supported the war, encouraged in part by the efforts of the Johnson administration and U.S. diplomats to build a democratic labor movement in Vietnam. Union families too supported the war, and their sons helped fight it. They were stunned to see college students carrying the Vietnamese flag and insulting veterans just back from combat. On the other hand, to many intellectuals in the anti-war movement, labor's support for the war simply illustrated that union leaders had sold out to capitalist exploiters. 13. By the 1980s, with unions weakening, employers went on the offensive in bargaining. According to Richard E. Walton, Joel E. Kutcher-Gershenfeld, and Robert B. McCursey, during the 1980s anywhere from one-third to one-half of all labor management agreements in the untied states were characterized by some form of concessions. 14. Many organized employers began to see in the collective bargaining process an opportunity to rid themselves of unions. The bargaining process easily lent itself to abuse through a three-step process. First, when a collective bargaining agreement was due to expire, the company would demand major concessions it knew the union could not possibly accept and would steadfastly reject all major union counterproposals. This could easily be done without violating the law. Unions would be forced to strike to prevent the employer from implementing its proposals, which it could do once the negotiation was at an impasse. Second, when the union struck, the employer would permanently replace the strikers. Third, the replacement workers would then vote to decertify the union. 15. Management-provoked strikes, used by Phelps, Dodge, Hormel, Boise Cascade, and International Paper Company, among others. 16. Were a common part of the 1980s labor relations scene. When management provoked strikes, unions did not know how to respond. They did not have in place alliances with other movements. They did not know how to apply economic pressure on employers beyond that which they could achieve through the establishment of a picket line. They relied on occasional advertising and statements from union leaders in the struggle to win over public opinion. They did not know how to harness the enormous potential of their membership during strikes. The problem of organizing became a crisis when unions were faced with the massive challenge of globalization. Jobs in union-organized heavy industry moved overseas. The heavily organized steel industry was probably the hardest hit. 17. The auto industry, once American-dominated and fully organized, underwent massive changes as American companies were forced to compete with less expensive, more fuel-efficient cars from around the world. And in the mid-1980s, the problem became acute when Japanese and Korean carmakers built plants in the United States and defeated the United Auto Workers, UAW, in a series of representation elections. 18. The big three automakers employ far fewer workers, and competition from Japanese carmakers, especially Toyota and Honda, is now being conducted from non-union plants in the United States. Indiana is a prime example. The auto industry once provided thousands of union jobs. Those are fast disappearing. New automaking jobs coming into the state are non-union. The largest new facility is the 5,000-worker Toyota manufacturing and assembly plant in Princeton, Indiana, built in 1996. It remains steadfastly non-union. Throughout the country, new factories owned by foreign car companies have defeated the UAW's organization efforts. By the end of the first decade of the 21st century, both ordinary people and right-wing political figures blamed the UAW for the crises in the U.S. auto industry. Over the past decade, unions have begun to concentrate once again on the need to organize. The most successful have begun to switch from single-unit campaigns, referred to as hot shop organizing, to broader, longer actions known as comprehensive campaigns. They have learned to use their economic power as an aid to organizing. They have tried to use their considerable political influence to change the law to make organizing in the face of employer opposition less difficult. Despite these welcome signs of renewed interest in organizing, however, there are serious differences in approaches among unions dedicated to organizing. Simply put, the issue is this: should unions insist on organizing from strength, using their members and developing a strong support in the target workforce? Or should they organize wherever possible, recognizing that in many cases they will have to build strength and solidarity after recognition has been achieved? Section 9 of the NLRA provides for secret ballot representation elections to determine whether the majority of workers in a potential bargaining unit wish to be represented by a particular union. The board's process has dominated organizing for over 60 years. It was established to promote the Act's basic policy, free choice. Free choice requires that employees feel free to choose or reject union representation without fear of economic reprisal by the employer or unlawful acts by the union. Although each individual worker is entitled to free choice, the wishes of the majority of the voters determine whether collective bargaining occurs. If a union wins a representation election, it is certified as the bargaining representative of the employees in the bargaining unit. The employer is then required to bargain with the union over the wages, hours, and conditions of employment for all employees in the unit. If the union loses the election, no collective bargaining takes place and the employer can continue to operate as it sees fit as long as it complies with the law generally. Since employers are eager to avoid unions and collective bargaining, the election is typically preceded by a campaign in which the employer seeks to per 23. Chapter 3 The NLRA. Organizing Process. Swayed its employees to vote against representation and the union makes the case for it. These election campaigns generally follow a predictable pattern. Organizing drives typically begin in response to employee discontent that is communicated to the union. Workplaces where workers are known to be unhappy are called hot shops, and are considered by union organizers to be prime targets for the union message of increased power and dignity for workers. Not all unions limit themselves to hot shops. Some unions pick their targets in terms of maintaining, obtaining, or increasing power in a particular location or with a particular employer. But hot shop organizing has been, and remains, the primary organizing technique of most unions. When a hot shop is located or brought to the attention of the union by an employee, an organizer is dispatched to evaluate the situation by talking with employees and trying to get a measure of the degree of discontent. Once the union decides to begin an organizing drive, it may enlist additional organizers. To establish employee ownership of the campaign and to spread the union's message more easily, organizers generally form employee organizing committees. Thereafter, either the organizer or the organizing committee will ask employees to sign authorization cards designating the union as the workers' representative for purposes of collective bargaining. Signing a card of this type is a major commitment that few employees make unless they want union representation. To get workers to sign up, the organizer or committee will stress the increased power and dignity that comes with worker solidarity. They will point out that union workers have higher wages and better working conditions. Union organizers will hand out union literature that stresses the power of the union and the value of collective bargaining agreements. Often, union organizers will ask the employees about the changes they would like to see and then show them contracts from other bargaining units that have achieved those improvements. When the union obtains signed authorization cards from a substantial majority of the employees it is seeking to organize, it will typically write a recognition letter to the company's chief executive officer advising that the union has signed up a majority of employees, offering to prove this to an impartial observer, and requesting that the company enter immediately into a bargaining relationship with the union. Employers rarely agree to bargain at this point. Instead, if they have not already done so in response to rumors or supervisory warnings, they will contact a management lawyer or labor relations consultant who will advise them to refuse recognition and to undertake a pre-election campaign to reduce the union's support. When its request for recognition is rejected, the union will file an election petition with the NLRB specifying the unit of employees that the union claims to represent. When the petition is filed, the employer can, and in most cases will, challenge the proposed unit, claiming that, for one technical reason or another, it is inappropriate under board standards. The employer might argue that some of the included employees are actually supervisors and thus ineligible for representation, or that the unit wrongly excludes employees who have a common interest with those included. Before the labor board proceeds to an election, the unit issue must be resolved either by board decision or by agreement of the parties. Raising the unit issues gives employers the ability to delay the election and mount a campaign to turn employees against the union. Eventually, the terms of the election and questions of eligibility are typically worked out by agreement of the parties. Almost invariably it is the union, fearful of losing its majority, that makes concessions and accepts the company's proposed unit. Employers may seek to reduce the number of employees in the unit and to eliminate key employees in order to weaken the union in subsequent bargaining or in the event of a strike. They may also seek to increase the unit in order to include employees whom they believe to be resistant to the union's message. Point 2. The end result of the process is a secret ballot election in which the employees vote either yes for unionization or no to reject it. Historically, for most elections, the union campaign was designed and controlled by the outside organizer who enlisted and signed up the workers, responded to management attacks, and calmed the fears of union supporters. It was the organizer who decided when it was time to petition for an election. And it was the organizer who initially determined whether the employer had violated the NLRA and if so, what action to take. Thus, the professional skill of the organizer was crucial to union success. Today, organizers tend to share responsibility with inside organizing committees, which makes campaigns more worker-controlled. Employer campaigns are usually directed by a labor relations professional, either an attorney or a management consultant. At one time, most employer representatives would conduct moderate campaigns, trying to stay within the law. Moderate campaigns had two advantages from the employer's point of view. If the employees voted no and there was no illegality, the matter ended with the election. If the union won the election, it would be easier to come to a reasonable agreement without the hostility likely to be created by threats or acts of reprisal. Employer lawyers who stayed within the law were convinced that they could run as successful anti-union campaigns as management representatives who relied on threats and reprisals. But according to experienced organizers, the era of the moderate campaign is largely past. The lawyers and consultants now most likely to be employed by management are those whose campaigns are always on the border of illegality or regularly go beyond it. The themes struck in formal employer campaigns have been remarkably similar across elections and time. They focus on four main areas: the likelihood of a strike, the cost of union dues, the uncertain outcomes of collective bargaining, and the fact that the union, by threatening the profitability of the employer, might cause harm to the employees. The emphasis on dues is intended to suggest that workers will pay a heavy price for union benefits and to attribute a mercenary motive to the union, thereby undercutting the idea that the union organizer is motivated by the desire to help workers. Why is this union interested in you? Why does this organizer who does not even live in this community care about whether or not you join the union? The answer is that you are a source of money to permit union bosses to live the high life they are now living. Employer campaigns often make the amount of the loss concrete. For instance, sometimes employers give the employee his or her pay in two checks, one reflecting the current wage minus expected dues and the other the amount of expected dues. Some employers put on display a large quantity of groceries that cost the same amount as monthly or yearly dues. Employer campaigns always stress that if the union wins the election, there is no assurance that the employee will obtain higher wages or increased benefits. The employer announces during the typical campaign that it will exercise its legal right to resist unreasonable demands. The employer will point out that, under the law, it is not required to sign a contract that it considers harmful to its business. And the employer will argue that if the union does not agree, the union's only recourse is to strike. Point 3. The possibility, indeed the likelihood, of strikes is a constant theme of all employer campaigns. Typical is the following excerpt from an actual campaign. Strikes are a brutal and unpleasant experience. You get no wages, no unemployment compensation, and new employees may be hired to permanently replace you. Strikes generate ill will. Violence is not uncommon. Management loses during a strike too. In a strike everyone loses, except the union organizer. He will draw his pay 52 weeks a year. 4. Focusing on strikes permits the employer to draw a sharp distinction between the needs of the workers and the motives of the unions. The employer typically seeks to paint union leaders as essentially indifferent to the welfare of the workers, whose lives they damage by forcing them to go on strike. Employer campaigns invariably seek to convince the employee that they have a stake in the business's profitability, a stake that the union threatens. The employer will claim that it is paying the workers as much as it can afford. The employer will either say or suggest that if the union harms profits, it threatens wages and ultimately the business itself. Point 5. Some variation of the following speech is almost always used. In the past, the company has given you all the wage increases and fringe benefits it could afford and still stay competitive. We have given you these things voluntarily and without your having to pay 1 cent to any outsider or having to strike. We have done this because we want this to be as good a place for you to work as this company's financial ability and business will permit. An implicit part of this argument is that the financial interests of the employees are inevitably tied to the employer's profitability. That the union does not realize this endangers both the employer and the employees. As one employer put it, we are not ashamed of being interested in profits. After all, if it wasn't for profits, there would be no reason for us to stay in business or provide jobs for you. Most employer statements leave the source of the harm likely to result from unionization somewhat ambiguous. Roland Sampson, formerly the Northeast Organizing Coordinator of the United Steelworkers, told me that most employers imply really bad things are going to happen if the union wins. You know, read between the lines. Some are more explicit in suggesting that the employer will retaliate against employees if they vote for the union. Explicit threats rarely come from top management but are sometimes made by supervisors in one-on-one situations. Some employers go further and fire employees whom they know to be active union supporters. According to Sampson, this technique has become increasingly frequent. One thing I'm now seeing quite a bit is they will find out who the leader is immediately, and they will find a way to terminate that person as soon as they can. They'll make up another excuse for the discharge, but the employees are not fooled. Such reprisals have two purposes. They remove a union supporter from the premises and from the voting rolls. They are also intended to intimidate the remaining employees. Of course, discharges undertaken for such purposes are unfair labor practices, but they are almost impossible to fully correct. The union must file charges with the NLRB to get the matter addressed. The employer will inevitably claim that the discharge was based on a legitimate cause having nothing to do with the organizing drive. A time-consuming process that may take years to finish ensues. In the meantime, the discharged employee is removed from the premises and the voting rolls. Even when the employer conducts an illegal campaign that includes reprisals and threats, it is common for the campaign literature to take a friendly tone, using first names in salutations and closings as if to demonstrate the employer's other, more humane, side. Frequently, employer literature purports to correct factual errors in the union's campaign or to convey information about the election process in a disinterested fashion. Such propaganda might be titled, Fact Sheet, or Information Bulletin, to contrast it with irresponsible union claims. If wages are low and working conditions poor, the company will stress job security or the fact that management has been willing to do small favors for employees, such as giving them time off in emergencies, lending them money, or permitting them to exchange shifts. The employer will claim that such behavior will become impossible once a union is on the scene and a collective bargaining agreement in force. Another standard management argument is that the union organizers are outsiders, angry mercenaries who make their living by promoting class warfare that will create a less friendly and more adversarial relationship between management and workers. Employers rarely attack the basic concept of unionism. They frequently acknowledge that unions once did good work, but always at other times, in other industries with other, less worker-friendly, employers. But, they insist, unions are no longer needed, not today, not here, not in this industry, this plant, this workforce. Unions have become too big, too rich, and too removed from the true interests of working people. Employers' campaigns frequently disclaim a general anti-union bias and instead characterize the union conducting the organizing drive as particularly corrupt, strike-prone, inappropriate for the employees, or insensitive to their needs. Employer campaigns are rarely completely negative. Management will suggest that it is sensitive to the concerns that led the employees to consider unionizing and that, given a chance, it will improve things on its own. Management will blame the law, which prohibits promises of benefits, for its inability to be more specific. Management campaigns are conducted through a variety of techniques. Prepared speeches to the assembled employees, letters written by management's lawyer but signed by someone in management, and often one-on-one conversations between supervisors and workers. Although the traditional arguments continue to be made regularly, according to union organizers that I have interviewed, management campaigns today are far more intense than they were in the 1970s or 1980s. Almost every management consultant or lawyer has certain tactics that he or she regularly uses. The double paycheck, the movie depicting the horror of a strike, and a guarantee letter that contains a place for the union organizer to sign pledging that workers will get more money or other benefits if the union wins. Some professionals like to conduct a survey in which employees are asked questions about their job attitudes in a way that suggests that changes will be made. If the professionals are good, they can survey without falling into the legal traps of soliciting grievances or promising benefits. A professional consultant often urges employers to get tough, to discharge employees thought to be union sympathizers as soon as they step out of line in any way. Some professionals urge their clients to act friendlier and more accommodating, but most suggest a business-as-usual approach. There is nothing in any of the management arguments that cannot be answered effectively by an experienced union spokesperson. Union organizers will counter management's contention that workers will be dragged out on strike by pointing out that strikes are rare and, in most cases, that they require a vote of the membership, often a two-thirds vote. Union organizers can point out that decisions concerning bargaining positions are made by the employees themselves. "You're the union," is a line that appears in almost every union campaign. Union spokespeople will argue that management can afford increased wages and benefits. Increasingly, unions will point to the great disparity between what the workers are paid and what top executives receive in salaries and bonuses. Often, the union will affirm its desire to be reasonable and permit the employer a fair profit. Unions usually waive dues until the new benefits are obtained. Able organizers have ready responses to the argument that they are unable to guarantee improvements. One organizer presented with an employer's guarantee letter explained his refusal to sign as follows: "What you get from the company isn't up to me. It depends on how strong you are and what you want. It's your local union, and if you support it, you'll be successful. 6. Through songs, literature, films, and meetings, unions try to convey a picture of the power of working-class solidarity and its ability to empower workers, giving them a voice at work that they never had before. Unions scoff at management reminders of personal favors to employees, arguing that such favors would not have been necessary in a unionized shop. Unions point with pride to their history, and their literature includes positive quotes from famous people. Which quotes they use in a particular election depends on the makeup of the workforce. For example, papal statements for Catholic workers and, for minority workforces, Martin Luther King Jr.'s comment that the labor hater and labor baiter is virtually always a twin-headed creature spewing anti-Negro epithets from one mouth and anti-union propaganda from the other mouth. 7. Where suggestions of improvements are made, the union will claim credit for them. A typical union letter argues that it took Local 561 to make the company discuss your needs, but have you been promised anything definite? Is it in writing? Is it signed? Whose word do you have that conditions will improve? The word of the company? Up to now that word hasn't been worth much to you. 8. Unions regularly criticize the employer's campaign, claiming that it was designed to frighten and confuse. The union will seek to reassure employees fearful of losing their jobs by pointing out that the NLRA forbids employer retaliation against union supporters. The union will emphasize that it will take whatever steps are necessary to protect its members and card signers. The union will also emphasize that the company campaign was designed by an outside union-busting lawyer or consultant whose exorbitant fees would have been far better spent on salary increases. It's a shame that the tremendous fee being paid to Mr. Flynn is not used as pay raises for you, instead of for scare letters. The campaigns of particular lawyers and consultants are sufficiently standardized that skillful organizers can predict the substance and sequence of their management campaigns in advance and rebut management's claims. The great advantage that employers have is not the strength of their arguments but their ability to make sure that all their employees hear them and hear them often and in different ways. 9. Another advantage that employers have is that unions stand for change and that for many, perhaps most, people, even those locked into situations that they find unsatisfactory, the thought of substantial change in their lives is frightening. Finally, because remedies are slow and inadequate, employers as a practical matter have the ability to discharge union leaders and thereby weaken or even destroy the inside organizing effort. Even in the absence of discriminatory discharges, it is very difficult for an outside organizer to give the employees needed reassurance with respect to the employer's arguments and the employees' concerns about change. For an organizing effort to be successful, the union campaign must be conveyed in part through well-respected fellow workers. This is a crucial part of the union campaign. The best organizing efforts constantly put forward the employee voice as the voice of the union. As Roland Sampson explained to me, the key under the operating conditions we have in this country is to have a well-trained informed organizing committee. Then we have a good shot at winning. Every employer campaign seeks to exploit employee fears of the consequences of unionization. Efforts to create or exploit fear inevitably carry some suggestion of possible reprisals. But it is not clear how this fear affects votes. An employee who fears reprisal and believes that the vote is secret, and the great majority of voters do, might well conclude that his or her interest would be best served by voting for a union that can provide needed protection against reprisals. Employees evaluate the union during the campaign. Will it be fair, reasonable, and democratic? Since the organizer initially stands for the union, employees will be likely to study the organizer's behavior for clues as to how the union will perform. In a typical campaign, at least some employees who are mildly in favor of unionization as an abstract concept will conclude on the basis of such observations that the particular union is unworthy of support. This is another reason unions today rely increasingly on internal organizing committees of respected employees to deliver their message. If the members of the organizing committee are not well respected, the union's chances of winning are substantially reduced. Unions that have secured card majorities often lose election campaigns. The gap between card majority and final outcome has helped generate two related, but as yet unproven, hypotheses. First, that employers generally win representation campaigns by frightening employees into voting against representation. And second, that management consultants are particularly skillful in devising means of frightening employees. I have my doubts. I interviewed over a dozen management consultants at length during the course of my study on union organizing, discussed in Chapter 17. I found them to be, in general, earnest but not terribly imaginative people. The campaigns that they conducted were based on simplistic models of employee behavior and did not depart from predictable themes and tactics. 10. I believe that the reputation of virulent anti-union consultants as having great skill in manipulating employee voting behavior is one of the myths of labor relations, a myth that persists and expands because its propagation is in the interests both of the consultants, who derive business from being perceived as tough and effective, and of the union organizers, who can then explain their failures in terms of the skill, resources, and ruthlessness of their opponents. This is not to say that union organizers are being dishonest, but rather that intimidation is a handy and, to some extent, self-exculpating way to explain an otherwise surprising loss. The NLRB election process applies only occasionally in the construction industry, where employers and unions are permitted to enter into recognition agreements before a construction project is undertaken. When such an agreement is entered into, employers generally agree to hire employees through union hiring halls. Employers sign these agreements for two reasons: to avoid labor strife in areas where unions are strong and to use the union hiring halls as a good place to get skilled workers. Also, the line between employers and workers and between supervisors and workers in the construction industry is not as clear as it is in other areas. Many small construction firms are owned by workers who maintain their union affiliation and sometimes work as employees. Union business agents in the industry are a part of management and often see their role as making sure that the job is properly staffed and well run. Unions are experimenting today. Even those unions that regularly use the NLRB election process are seeking new ways to organize. John Hyatt, the general counsel of the AFL-CIO, told me of a campaign by the United Steelworkers to organize 10,000 car wash workers in Los Angeles. The campaign arose out of an affiliation between the steelworkers and community groups. The community groups were starting a labor standards enforcement campaign. They had been working on it for a year. They came to realize that even if they were successful in getting these 500 employers who are all sub-minimum wage up to minimum wage, that when the spotlight disappeared and the labor enforcement agencies backed off, standards would revert unless there was unionization and collective bargaining as an ongoing enforcement mechanism. And so they came to us and invited us to find a union that would go in and partner with them to make this a joint community labor campaign. Foundations are very interested in this, and I think it's potentially a wonderful model of community labor cooperation. Experimentation is likely to continue as long as the current system remains in force. All union organizers agree that this system is badly in need of reform. Unite Here is dedicated to organizing and motivated by a powerful sense of movement. How it came to this position is an important, sometimes inspiring, sometimes frustrating story. The union has overcome employer opposition, legal harassment, and internal schisms. Its story is illustrated primarily by the history of its major component, HERE. HERE began in 1891 as the Waiters and Bartenders National Union, affiliated with the American Federation of Labor, AFL.1. Many of its members were immigrants, and meetings were often conducted in German and French as well as in English. It began as a union of skilled craftsmen with little interest in the unskilled and exploited, often immigrant, workers who staffed the back of the house, in both restaurants and hotels. The union's early development was controlled largely by Jerry Sullivan of St. Louis, the secretary-treasurer. Sullivan was honest and dedicated but far from a supporter of inclusive unionism. Slight and carefully groomed, with piercing eyes and a stern, no favors asked expression, Sullivan was not interested in bringing the great mass of immigrant workers from Eastern and Southern Europe into the union's ranks. 35. Chapter 4 Here in its history. 20 years after its founding, the union had barely scratched the surface of the hotel and restaurant business. Its membership made up less than 10% of the restaurant workforce, and it had little impact on wages and working conditions. Despite its claims to represent hotel and restaurant employees generally, it was known by most as the Irish Bartenders Union. 2. In 1912, the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, often referred to as the Wobblies, established the rival Hotel Workers Industrial Union to compete with HERE, and in the second decade of the 20th century they had considerable success, focusing on low-wage, mistreated immigrant workers. The success of the Wobblies forced HERE to pay greater attention to the less skilled workers in the industry, but always over the determined opposition of Jerry Sullivan, who referred to the Wobblies as loud-mouthed demagogues, destined for dark dismal failure. 3. However, acting on their own, local leaders of HERE enlisted some of the IWW leaders and members in new locals. The union slowly expanded during the period leading up to World War I. However, the advent of Prohibition in 1920 had a catastrophic impact on its membership. Prohibition cost jobs, and unemployed waiters and bartenders were inevitably drawn to speakeasies and to association with bootleggers and organized crime. The influence of criminals in the union was to remain a problem throughout the 20th century. By the middle of the 1920s, the union's total membership was below 40,000. The limited force of HERE nationally contrasted with the broad-based organizing on the West Coast, San Francisco in particular. Its Local 2 was led by Hugo Ernst, a classically educated immigrant from Croatia. Ernst, the son of a rabbi, was elected secretary of the San Francisco Waiters Union in 1910 as the result of a grassroots uprising against the incumbent leadership. 4. Ernst, like Sullivan, was a dedicated and ambitious union leader and was honest and tough. But he was far to the left of Sullivan politically. In 1922 he ran for Congress as a socialist against an anti-labor Republican incumbent and had the satisfaction of rolling up a very large protest vote, 5 In 1923 he traveled across the country visiting state and local here headquarters. He issued a report that highlighted the problems that the Union would experience for most of the 20th century. Indeed, many of these problems continued to trouble the Union 50 years after Ernst issued his report. In St. Louis, Ernst commented about the absence of cooperation between the waiters and waitresses. They seem to have inaugurated a system of catch as catch can, and when the girls organize a house the boys try to take it away from them and vice versa. The consequence is that no one has anything. He also pointed out that the new, monster, Statler Hotel had hired mainly non-union Negro and Mexican workers and girls, whom the Union ignored. In Cincinnati he reported that there is no Union housecard in Cincinnati. The waiters are continually fighting with the cooks. Girls are absolutely unorganized. He commented on the lack of organizing in Washington with only 375 members and the weak state of the Union in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Atlantic City. 6. In almost all the cities he visited, Ernst was disturbed by the long-term impact of the Union's relationship with racketeers and bootleggers, which was forged because of Prohibition. He described Local 5 in New York as more of a speakeasy than a union. In Chicago he detailed in a sarcastic, angry tone how one of two gangsters vying for the presidency of Local 7 had shot and killed the other. To his credit, Sullivan was galvanized by Ernst's report and took action against some of the abuses that Ernst had discovered. For example, after a follow-up investigation, Sullivan concluded that the moral atmosphere surrounding the headquarters of Local 7 is wholly repugnant to decent men. Soon its charter was revoked. 7. For his troubles Ernst was physically attacked at the next Union convention. Sullivan was one of the first to speak up on his behalf. Sullivan died in 1928 and was replaced by Robert Hesketh of Seattle. Hesketh and longtime Union President Edward Floor were eager to expand the Union's organizing efforts. But they faced enormous problems, including the corrupting influence of Prohibition and the connection between locals in major cities and the racketeers and bootleggers. The Union also had to contend with resistance from established locals and battles with rival unions. From 1929 onward, it was confronted with the Great Depression, which almost destroyed all hotel and restaurant business. Several hotel associations used the Depression as an occasion for union busting. 8 Hotel chains at or near bankruptcy demanded wage cuts and ignored existing contracts. Workers without funds were in no position to strike, and on those occasions when they struck, they were replaced by desperate, unemployed workers forced to apply for jobs as scabs. Even Ernst's Local 2 was almost wiped out. 9 The Union's membership dropped from about 40,000 in 1929 to below 25,000 in 1933. During the early 1930s, here membership hit its low point. Low wages and terrible working conditions existed throughout the hospitality industry. According to Matthew Josephson, a $1 wage for a full day's employment was not unusual. Waiters, working a 10-hour day at certain clubs, were provided with one meal which they had to eat while standing up. This set the stage for a revival of organizing led by militant organizers using strikes, sit-ins, and demonstrations. A key example of the Union's new approach to organizing during the late 1930s was provided by Local 705 in Detroit, where organizing was spearheaded by two young, dynamic firebrands, Myra Wolfgang and Floyd Lowe. Their organizing techniques, as described by Jean Mattern Patron, were aggressive. Among other actions, they staged what was probably the first sit-in ever at a Woolworths store. They walked into the main F.W. Woolworth store at Woodward and Grand River on a busy Saturday. Streak. The strident order rang out as Lowe blew a shrill blast on a whistle. Shoppers looked about in confusion as cash register drawers banged shut and clerks refused to make sales. Intimidated as they saw the doors of the store being taken over by Union agents, shoppers meekly permitted themselves to be herded out of the store. "Tell them what to do, girls," Lowe yelled. The girls obliged, clamoring for Woolworth managers to get the hell out of here. Local Woolworth executives were already on their way to Woodward and Grand River, where they were confronted by Union representatives, voicing their demands. The stakes rose as Union President Koenig announced the Union was considering expanding the strike to include all 40 Woolworth stores in the Detroit area. He would participate shortly in a telephone conference with officers in Buffalo, New York, Koenig elaborated, at which time a decision would be made as to whether the strike would go nationwide, taking in Woolworth's 200 stores. Myra moved about the store, offering encouragement and banter. Myra also scheduled rounds of pep talks, bringing in Francis Comfort, who represented the Detroit Federation of Teachers. Francis Comfort told the strikers, "Some people say you're lawbreakers, but I am here, a schoolteacher, proud to be among you. Many of you girls were in my classes in school and there you were trained to expect something from life. You find yourselves here behind a counter, working for a hopeless pay. You are fighting not only for yourselves, but for thousands of girls like yourselves all through the county. 3 days of negotiations brought the Woolworth strike to a settlement before Koenig's announced deadline with a major concession from the company, payment to striking employees for work time lost during the sit-down. The union agreed to accept a 5-cent an hour raise and won its other objectives, including a 48-hour week and a 1-week vacation with pay after a year of employment, as 40 Woolworth stores were brought under union hiring policies. 10. Local 705 followed up its victory with a series of direct action organizing drives. Similar actions took place around the country. New locals were formed. Existing locals regained their losses, and some defunct locals were reorganized. It was during this period that the union moved away from its focus on skilled craftspeople and began to organize on a wall-to-wall basis, including, for the first time, bellboys, porters, housemaids, and dishwashers. 11. By the time of the union's 1936 convention, President Floor was able to announce to the cheering delegates that the union's membership was approaching 100,000. Among the delegates were many new members, including many women. But the high spirits of the convention were quickly dimmed by the gang murder of a leading local officer, who had connections to the Dutch Schultz mob, and the wounding of 2 other delegates. It was clear that the battle with criminal elements in the union was far from over. Between 1936 and 1938, a major effort was made by Chicago mobsters connected with Al Capone to elect George B. McLean, head of the Chicago Local, as president of the National Union. The effort was thwarted. A key moment occurred during the 1938 convention. President Floor gave an enthusiastic report pointing out that the union's membership was now over 200,000. In a direct challenge to McLean and the mob, he concluded his speech by stating, "We propose to keep our flag flying to the wind. There must and will be no surrender." When his speech concluded, Hugo Ernst descended to the floor and promptly yelled for all floor men to follow him. Many delegates jumped from their seats and were led by Ernst back to the platform where they hoisted the president to their shoulders. 12. Between 1935, when Congress passed the NLRA, and 1941, when the United States entered World War II, the union increased its already vigorous organizing efforts, reaching out to lower-paid workers, maids, doormen, bellhops, janitors, laundry attendants. Much of the organizing was done through strikes demanding union recognition. Women workers emerged from the strikes with a new reputation for being tough and steadfast. Myra Wolfgang, who was among other things an early fighter for women, civil rights, and racial equality, became the secretary-treasurer of Local 705 and the first female vice president of an international union. In 1945, Floor died and was replaced as president by Hugo Ernst, who continued Floor's emphasis on organizing. The union added organizers and devoted much of its money to expansion. By the time of its 1947 convention, the union had over 300,000 members. Ernst died in 1954 of a heart attack. He left the union with a large membership and many dedicated activists. Nevertheless, problems of racketeering, sexism, racism, and political division lay just beneath the surface. And they came to the fore quickly under his successor, Ed S. Miller of Kansas City. When he was selected, Miller seemed like a fine choice, young, energetic, and personable. He had organizing experience and was deemed independent and honest. Miller was re-elected regularly at the union's conventions and remained president until 1973. In many ways, Miller typified the business model of leadership that came to dominate the labor movement during the late 1950s and 1960s. The union did little organizing. Key decisions were made without the membership's participation. The president had the final say on all decisions. Miller seemed to devote much of his time and energy to remaining in office. Internal union politics was his concern, not building the strength of existing locals. During his presidency, membership dropped and collective bargaining stagnated. Many committed unionists within here were dismayed by Miller's failures. But a significant opposition movement did not develop. Among the fiercest critics of the union during the Miller period was Vincent, Vinnie, Cirabella, who, probably more than anyone else, helped guide and revitalize the union. Born in 1922 in Providence, Rhode Island, Vinnie Cirabella was the child of working-class immigrant parents. His family went from poor to abject misery during the Depression. "We had maybe 10 sticks of furniture in the whole damn house, including the table and chairs in the kitchen. We couldn't pay the rent. We were evicted at least 15 different times. I would come home from school and see those sticks on the sidewalk. It was horrible." His father was a cook, at that time among the most exploited workers in the city. His mother was a maid who contributed to the family income by cleaning the houses of rich Providence families. Late in his life, Cirabella still recalled with a mixture of shame and anger watching his mother clean dirty toilets and dirty bathrooms, and clean up the vomit on the rugs, which made her grow old in a hurry. The great trauma of Cirabella's life was the early death of his mother during childbirth. 12-year-old Vincent was forced to drop out of school. His first full-time job was as a dishwasher during the height of the Depression. The experiences of poverty, degradation, and loss were never far from his mind. I saw the unfairness of it. I saw my father as a very hard-working man who wanted to work, couldn't get a job. I saw my mother die on a charity bench. I held her hand in the hospital the night she died. My brother lived and she died. That was a devastating thing to lose a mother in those years. I was only about 11 and a half at the time. I just looked at the country as a system that gave the ordinary person no chance at all. My father wasn't a drinker, my mother was a good woman. We weren't given the opportunity. I just inherently saw that it was wrong and something had to be done about it. I was filled with anger and the desire to get even in some way. Cirabella's anger was directed primarily at those whom he saw as the exploiters of workers and at those who talked about worker solidarity but failed to back up their words. During his teenage years, he spent much of his non-working time listening to Anna B., the Red Flame, orating in the Balbo Hill district of Providence, excoriating the bosses and the political system. Her message resonated with his feelings. It's always them and us. It's always the haves versus the have-nots. It's never changed from time immemorial, and we have to combat that in whatever way we can. During the 1950s and 1960s, when union leaders felt important and accepted, they accused him of having an outdated Depression mentality. People tell me the 30s and 40s are over and you still have a chip on your shoulder. You're a Depression kid. That was true. I did have a chip on my shoulder, no question about it. But I always felt strongly and I still feel that way. Cirabella believed that worker organization was the answer to class exploitation. Unionism became the central focus of his life, a channel for the expression of his anger and an outlet for idealism. The union movement also gave him the opportunity to use his intellect, focus his ambition, and exercise his passion for words. Cirabella was always ambitious for leadership, but his ambition did not lead him to curry favor with those in power. While he was still in his teens, an act of dissent almost ended his union career. In 1940 some of the waiters approached me. They were all immigrants and said that they thought that Billy Gill, the incumbent, was not giving them a fair shake and they wanted that change. I agreed with them, so I made a 2-sentence speech. I said, I think Billy Gill has had enough time to show what he could do and I don't think he's done very much. I think we ought to give someone else a chance. I nominate Brother Irving Kornstein. The result was immediate retaliation. I was working then at a little French hotel and the head waiter said to me, Cirabella, I'm sorry but I have to let you go. I said, what do you mean? I don't understand, let me go for what? He said the orders come from Mr. Dreyfus upstairs. You're a good boy, I like you, but you have to go. What happened was the union president after the meeting called Mr. Dreyfus at the hotel and told him I was underage to serve liquor. I was 18 at that time and looked older, and so they fired me and that was my first union experience. Cirabella spent the period from 1942 to 1945 in the Navy. When he was discharged, he returned to the union and his work as a waiter. In 1951 he ran for the position of union business agent. He lost and suddenly found himself out of work. I was blackballed, couldn't get a job, the union would not send me out, and employers didn't want me. I was known as an agitator and for 2 years I couldn't work, so I sold Fuller brushes and then I sold vacuum cleaners door to door. For someone who had been making good money and who prided himself on his skill as a waiter, the situation was intolerable. And Cirabella was not one to passively accept injustice. I walked into the hall one day in a union office and said, let me tell you something. I have a wife and 2 kids, and you have blackballed me for 2 years. If I don't get a job pretty soon, I'm going to pick you up, carry you up to the 2nd floor, and throw you right out in the middle of the street. I meant it. A short while later Cirabella was offered and accepted a job in the black part of town in a nightclub called the Celebrity Club. He was warned that, in this place you're going to wait on niggers and chinks and pimps and whores. Vinny took the job, which furthered his preparation for union leadership. I got to understand something about the black people and culture and their history. I viewed them as just another group of immigrants who were being pissed on, who needed help, and more desperately than the other kinds of immigrants in many ways. During this period Cirabella continued to learn as much as he could about the labor movement. I spent an enormous amount of time with old-time labor leaders, progressive labor leaders, talking with them. That's one of the things my wife used to give me hell about. I would leave work or have a day off, and I'd be talking with these guys or going to other meetings. I recognized how low my base was. I had no education and I had to learn. I was soaking it up like a sponge, and I gravitated toward those from whom I could learn. He continued to oppose the existing leadership, and sometime in the early 1950s Cirabella filed charges against the local's business agent. I charged him with negotiating sweetheart contracts, with neglect of duty, with disgracing himself and demeaning us by coming into the place he's working drunk. He did it everywhere. I brought him up on charges. His cousin conducted the hearing and tried to whitewash everything. I was booed rather heavily. Shortly thereafter, Vinny participated in a general strike by the Providence local, which a vice president of the union settled on his own terms, a settlement totally favorable to the employers. Cirabella openly expressed his outrage. When no changes were made, he led a group of dissatisfied members of the local into the then-rival Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO. He remained in the CIO until the AFL and CIO merged in 1957, at which point he returned to here full of ideas to achieve greater rank-and-file involvement in the running of the union. Both he and his ideas were quickly rejected by the conservative leadership of the local. In 1957 he ran as an insurgent for business manager of the local and was attacked in a series of leaflets calling him a Bolshevik. Till the day of his death, he believed that, had the ballots been honestly counted, he would have won. 3 days after the election, the international representative came to me, and he said, "Let me ask you something, Cirabella. Would you take a job for us out of town?" I said absolutely, and he said, "Does it make any difference where you go?" I said no. In 1958 Cirabella accepted the position of business agent for the nearly extinct Local 217 in New Haven, Connecticut. He knew that the offer was made to get him away from Providence. As one of the union's current officers explained, they wanted him out of Providence, which at the time was 2,000 people. They didn't want him running against the officers in Providence. They wanted to get him the hell out of there, so they gave him little, broken down Local 217, and it had 60 people at the time. Cirabella focused much of his attention on forming coalitions with other unions, and within 2 years, he became the president of the Greater New Haven Central Labor Council, CLC. Even though he held many positions that were unpopular 13 and many that were controversial 14, but he was a charismatic leader, handsome, with a large, open face, flowing gray hair over a broad forehead, a Roman nose, a strong jaw, and a friendly smile. Cirabella became a community activist and was ahead of his time in speaking of labor issues in terms of human and civil rights. 15. He developed a friendship with New Haven's charismatic mayor Richard Lee and used their friendship to organize city workers and restaurants. His organizing technique, which involved the use of political pressure, was unusual at the time. As described by Betsy Aaron, when he heard that a restaurant or a hotel was opening, he would call the owner and threaten to throw up a picket line, which his friend, the mayor, would be loath to cross. Often, that was enough to get union recognition. In other cases, he used the hiring hall model. As restaurants opened, he went after them with a nucleus of workers. He told the owners, "You open a new place like this, they're, the workers, naturally anxious to go there. You'd rather have them inside than outside on opening day." He organized from the top down, on the assumption that the workers would have been pro-union if he had had the resources to organize them. 16. It was in 1969 that the maintenance and food service workers of Yale, who had lost a strike in 1968 in part because of poor leadership, asked Cirabella to become their full-time business manager. He agreed and set about uniting the union, which was split along race, craft, and ethnic lines. The Yale Local 35 required constant attention, and Cirabella realized that he needed to find a successor as business agent for Local 217. He decided to advertise the position. He placed an ad in the New Haven newspaper that has since become part of labor folklore. Wanted, labor trainee, person willing to work long hours for low pay in order to learn to be a labor leader. Must be unmarried. The latter requirement was added to ensure that the person would be able to devote all his time to the demanding job. Among those who answered the ad was John Wilhelm, an honors graduate of Yale and a former leader of students for a Democratic Society, SDS, who had been active in the anti-war and civil rights movements. Wilhelm was working at the time as a community organizer but was frustrated with the job, which he decided did little to improve life for the poor people that he served. He concluded that their main needs were economic, not social. What they needed were better jobs, with higher pay and decent working hours. Wilhelm agreed to work long hours and accept low pay. The problem was that he was recently married and wanted to stay that way. Cirabella liked everything else that he heard and finally agreed to take Wilhelm despite his being married. The fact that Wilhelm had once been a member of SDS would have made him anathema to most union leaders, but the passion of the student movement was what Cirabella was seeking. As Wilhelm explained many years later, Vinny had a theory that one of the things the labor movement needed to do to revitalize itself, to get out of its complacency and lack of organizing, was to tap into the energies of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, and that's why he hired me. Wilhelm was hired in 1969 to be the sole staff member and business agent of Local 217. Yale is an imposing place. Its officials are bright, articulate, and self-confident. Its alumni are rich, powerful, and distinguished, its faculty eminent, its students marked for success. Outsiders tend to admire it, and very few want to do battle with it. But Wilhelm, having graduated from Yale with high honors, had long lost that sense of inadequacy that almost all newcomers to the institution feel. In fact, he had never quite been comfortable with its affluent style and its lack of concern for the townspeople who worked in its offices, dormitories, and dining halls. I was absolutely blown away by that. I literally never knew there was a place like this where people had those attitudes. 17. Wilhelm had found his calling. He began his new job by reading the tracts that Cirabella had negotiated. He realized that they went beyond bread and butter issues to concerns over dignity and providing for adequate vacations. I remember the vomit clause, for example. There's a clause that he had put in the contract that said that if a maid had to clean up a room in which someone had vomited, they got paid an extra $1. It's not a big deal. But it showed he cared about more than bread and butter issues. And I later learned, which I had no way of knowing then, that in spite of the small size of this town and the small size of the local, those were among the best contracts in the United States. Shortly after being hired, Wilhelm became Cirabella's driver. On the second or third day, I'm eternally grateful for this, he lost his driver's license. He is the worst driver on the face of this earth. He got multiple speeding tickets, and they finally took his license away. It was the greatest thing that ever happened because I drove him everywhere for 30 days. I just followed him around. That was an experience. In the course of a month he did everything there is to do, negotiated grievances, met with some organized workers, did some organizing. It was during his work with Cirabella that Wilhelm developed his philosophy of union leadership. I'll tell you the things I think I learned from him right at the beginning. One was that you had to be militant in order to get anywhere. Even more important was to have faith in the members. I have never to this day met another person, including myself, who has such endless faith in the workers. He absolutely believes that as long as you provide the workers with the facts and as long as you give them some leadership, they'll always do the right thing, whatever that is. Wilhelm believed that he was uniquely fortunate to have Cirabella as his union mentor. I had the unparalleled opportunity to virtually live with Vinny from 1969 to 1973. That was an education that could never be replicated, in particular because of the extraordinary range of his union, community, and political leadership, as well as his really remarkable abilities. Everything we did basically was fun. One of the things he always lectured me on was that the day-to-day representation of servicing the workers had to be good. He always told me that while weak contracts were a problem, the lack of day-to-day servicing was a bigger problem. His philosophy was that the business agents should do everything, including handling arbitrations, which he personally was very, very good at. He handled several in Local 217 and I watched several at Yale. A lot of lawyers and other arbitrators, people like that were dumbstruck. I think a lot of people who came to understand what an effective labor leader he is would still be surprised that he's so good at technical exercises like that. Again, one of the remarkable features about the guy is that while he thinks in very big terms, thinks about the big picture all the time from the day I met him, he also is insistent on excellence on nuts and bolts in the day-to-day stuff, and he always said you can't do one without the other. You cannot ignore the day-to-day needs of the members and pretend to think about the big picture. 18. Some of Cirabella's friends in the labor movement thought that he was running a risk of being replaced by his new Yale-educated assistant. Cirabella, confident of his own ability, laughed them off. Cirabella preached that all strikes and organizing are ultimately about dignity and that constant, aggressive organizing was crucial to the survival of the labor movement. He had developed his own approach to organizing, one that centered on using a committee of workers to play the key role in the effort. It was an approach that made Local 217 one of the most successful organizing locals in the country. The more Wilhelm learned about organizing, the more he was surprised at the lack of organizing commitment and skill in the labor movement generally. He came to the conclusion that a major reason for the failure of unions to organize effectively was the purge of anyone thought to be radical during the McCarthy years. They chased out a lot of people who might have withstood the complacency that developed. That Miller and his cohorts failed to chase out Cirabella was not for lack of trying. As Wilhelm explained, he only survived because he is the toughest person on earth. Cirabella transformed Local 35 by establishing a leadership structure and creating a spirit of solidarity. The first task required time, patience, and a belief in the ability of the members. I set up a shop steward system. I trained them myself, trained functional illiterates. I tested them orally. I showed them alternative ways to fulfill those responsibilities. 50% of the bargaining unit couldn't read very well, most of them couldn't write at all, especially in housekeeping and to a great extent in the kitchen. The second task required toughness and vision, a perfect fit for Cerebella. I had to pull the blacks and the whites together because there was an awful division between the groups here and between the skilled and the unskilled. The snobs in the powerhouse and the building trade sector would say something about those nigger dishwashers, and I said, wait a minute, you can't win it without those niggers and without those dishwashers, and don't you ever forget that, brother. I don't care what you do after 5 o'clock. Do whatever you want, but between 8 and 5 you better be together or I'm taking a walk. The thing I pounded at, it's your battle, not mine. You have to assume the burden, it's going to be your union. It didn't happen immediately. I had to work on it very hard. But finally, they began to come together. By 1971, when negotiations for a new contract were scheduled, the union was still in the process of transformation. Wages and working conditions were poor. Lower wage workers, primarily women and minorities, earned only barely above the legal minimum wage. They were laid off at summertime, at Christmas, and at spring break. Fully a third of them were on welfare. 19 Wilhelm did not think that the union was ready to strike. He believes that the Yale negotiator was instructed to encourage a strike in order to crush the union. The time seemed ripe. As Cerebella noted in a report to the union's General Executive Board, the union's vulnerability was evident. We could strike on May 1st. 5 weeks later most of the students would be going home for the summer. 2 weeks later graduation would be held. 1 week after that, Mr. Brewster, Yale's president, was going to London. Other negatives were the 12% unemployment rate in New Haven, the past history of student scabbing, the always uncertainness of rank and file cohesion under the stress of a strike, especially a lengthy one, and the strength of our adversary Yale's awesome power. Yale's chief negotiator told Cerebella that, what's required now by the union leaders is statesmanship, as John L. Lewis demonstrated when he agreed to abolish the jobs of thousands of miners in order to protect the jobs of a fewer number of men. It must have given Cerebella, the 9th grade dropout and lifetime student of rhetoric, great pleasure to respond in elegant language paraphrasing Winston Churchill. Our rejoinder was, the mine workers' example is neither analogous nor germane to the issue at hand. Moreover, to paraphrase a political leader of the past, we wish to inform you that we did not become the leadership of this union to preside over its liquidation. 20. Negotiations quickly reached an impasse. The strike that followed was bitter. It ended friendships that Cerebella had formed with Yale people in the anti-war movement, in which he had played an important role. 21. They were nowhere to be found when the Yale workers had it on the line, he told me. I remember in particular Sloane Coffin. At one point I wanted to rip his head off. Nor did he find much support during the negotiations from the Yale students, many of whom at that time considered themselves radicals. New Left students had, for the most part, little sympathy with old line unions like. Here, they considered organized labor, at best, a movement whose time had come and gone. Cerebella was an anachronism. My style bothered those kids, too. I guess I was an enigma to a lot of people around then. How can this guy be a liberal? How can this guy be really legitimate and genuine when he's wrapped up in the cause of the workers here? He's your institutional type, an old guy. He's this and that and the other thing. I think I had a major problem with every group on this campus. When the strike occurred, Wilhelm thought it likely to be lost. I think any rational person, including myself, I'm embarrassed to say, would have never led that strike. Not only then but now, knowing what I know today, I would have been reluctant to lead that strike, and I'm embarrassed to say that. I didn't take him on about it at all. According to Wilhelm, the strike that followed was kept alive only by Cerebella's toughness and determination. He carried that goddamn thing on his back and there's no other way to look at it, and he particularly talked about the lower paid people, especially the blacks. That strike really had very much of a civil rights theme to it. The union had hoped to embarrass the university by getting Willy Brandt, the Chancellor of West Germany, to refuse the honorary degree that Yale offered him. But despite requests from various senior officials in the labor movement, Brandt announced that he would attend and accept the honorary degree. Some urged calling off the strike at that point, but Cerebella refused. His report to the union's executive committee described the events leading up to the strike. On Thursday, June 10, the executive board of Local 35 issued the following statement. The Local 35 Executive Board will recommend at the meeting that the members adopt a plan for massive nonviolent demonstration to prevent business as usual at Yale's commencement ceremonies next Monday and at the other commencement and reunion festivities scheduled for the next 10 days. Brewster has left us with no choice but to say to Yale that it will not be allowed to celebrate its graduation as usual. On the next night, June 11, 800 members poured into the auditorium to participate in the nonviolent demonstration on Monday, June 14. George Wiley had loaned us one of his key men, Bruce Thomas, who addressed our members. Wilhelm considered Thomas's contribution particularly valuable. "He's the best street organizer I have ever seen in my entire life, a tall, handsome black guy, maybe 30. The guy was a phenomenon, one of these people who could get people he never met before to do things that afterwards they would say, 'Exactly how did I ever do that?' There were about 700 people there. Vincent talked about the contract and the struggle, and Bruce got up and talked about the battle for human rights. And Bruce had that crowd of people, diverse as they were at Wilbur Cross High, all standing up holding hands, singing, 'We shall overcome.' I've never seen anything like that in my entire life." Cirabella later told me that Thomas's speech was just so wonderful, tears were streaming down everyone's eyes in the whole auditorium, including mine. I finally wound up saying, "You can rest assured Yale will not be permitted to have its traditional pompous ceremony in the streets on Monday. We will not permit them to have it." Black and white workers locking hands and singing, "We shall overcome," doesn't seem particularly inspiring or surprising by today's standards. But back in 1971, the antagonism in the North between white ethnic groups and civil rights activists was fierce and often violent. It was a testament to Cirabella's effectiveness and Thomas's rhetoric that the Yale workers had overcome ethnic divisions in favor of class-based solidarity. Efforts to negotiate an agreement went on at a frantic pace over the weekend, but they failed. On Monday morning, June 14 at 9 a.m., our members plus several hundred others, about 1,500, assembled on the lower green adjacent to the university. Our objective was to confront Brewster during the graduation procession and demand that he enter the negotiations to help end the strike. Father James Groppe, the civil rights priest from Milwaukee, spoke about the justice and morality of our cause and his willingness to join in support of the Union. His presence was especially uplifting for the many Irish, Italian, and Polish Catholics in our Union. At 10 we began our march with one of our members leading, carrying the American flag. We stopped at a point 2 blocks away where the procession would pass. However, in an effort to avoid us, Yale for the first time in its history detoured its procession. When we spotted the rerouted procession we hurried there. A cordon of police with clubs raised had formed to block us. I was the first one arrested. 11 others, including Father Groppe, would quickly follow. Some of the police panicked and swung their clubs at our members with recklessness. One member received an 18-inch head wound. The secretary of Local 217, John Wilhelm, was viciously clubbed over the back by a berserk cop. Many others had an assortment of injuries and bruises. 3 hours later I was released from jail and rejoined our members, who had been kept together in song by George Wiley. We publicly vowed to go to jail daily if necessary. We marched through the streets to Brewster's house, and demonstrated, and then to the Lawn Club where Brandt was honored at a luncheon. After serenading the Chancellor, we marched back to our strike headquarters. The following Friday the class reunions were scheduled and we promised disruption of those activities. On Tuesday the mediators said that Yale would like to meet on Thursday. We reached agree. Meant late Friday afternoon. The 3-year contract was ratified on Saturday. Out of this struggle we built a union that will never be pushed around again. 22. Cirabella thought that the attack on Wilhelm was particularly valuable to the union and embarrassing for the university. What they did to John was something awful. We had films of that. We went to Channel 8. We were thinking of filing a brutality suit. It shows this cop whacking John with a club, and John is down on the ground. John was pulling away, trying to get away from this animal, and he drags himself about 10 feet and tries to get up, and they keep hitting him. He did it a third time, and the same thing happened. When I heard all this shit, I really got angry, and I picked up a bullhorn and I said, "Let me tell you something, Brewster, you didn't beat us today. We beat you, and let me tell you something else. We're going to do this every day for the rest of the strike. We're going to get justice one way or another. They can start arresting us tomorrow and the day after, and when those old guys come this weekend, we're going to do a number on them." The shared, emotionally powerful experience tightened the bond between Wilhelm and Cirabella. The sight of Wilhelm crawling to his feet after each beating was stirring to Cirabella, who might have seen in it a metaphor for his own career in the Union. Wilhelm considered this victory one of Cirabella's greatest achievements. If you compare the 68 contract with the 71 contract, you'd think you were on a different planet. I don't personally know of another achievement that can be compared to that. He did it with no staff, no stewards, no structure, no nothing. He probably succeeded because of his enormous personal strength. No matter what was going on, no matter which individual was opting out or losing their nerve, he never once thought that the workers were doing anything but the right thing, and that's one of the reasons why we won that. I could not have done that then, and I'm not sure I could do it now, and I don't know anybody else who could either.
In the aftermath of Local 35's victory, Wilhelm was shocked to learn that Cirabella was treated with disdain by the union's national leadership. At one point, Cirabella drove to Cincinnati to meet with the National Union president, Ed Miller. It was a depressing meeting. According to Wilhelm, Vinnie told Miller that he wanted to do something more than what he was able to do in Connecticut. Miller said, "Forget it, there's nothing for you to do and there's nothing to be done." Cirabella would regularly appear before the annual January meeting of the union's executive board, 23, preaching the need for rank-and-file involvement, greater militancy, and a greater focus on organizing. His comments were not merely ignored, they were treated with open contempt. As recalled by Wilhelm, Ed S. Miller didn't just turn his back. "I saw with my own eyes that when Miller was general president, he would get up from his chair when Vinnie sat down in the speaker's chair, and would return only when Vinnie had finished." Wilhelm witnessed this travesty of Union democracy in 1971, 1972, and 1973. Local 35 struck again in 1974 and 1977.
After these strikes, the union had finally achieved a major goal of year-round employment and a livable wage for all Yale employees. I was a visiting professor at Yale Law School during the 1977 strike. The strike had aroused a great deal of interest, especially, but by no means solely, among black students, who recognized that many of the lowest paid of the maintenance workers were black.
I had the chance to watch Cirabella in a debate with Yale's chief labor negotiator. The debate was held in the packed auditorium of the law school. By then Cirabella had learned how to appeal to student opinion, and by the middle of the debate, outrage at Yale's refusal to make a decent proposal on wages and healthcare was widespread. With Cirabella sailing along and student support for the strike growing with almost each exchange, I saw a small knot of students huddling together. They seemed unhappy with the pro-union turn of events. Afterward, one of the group was recognized and said something like the following: "Mr. Cirabella, you've told us about the suffering of the strikers and they're trying to get along without their pay and the indifference of management, but what about you? Aren't you still getting your pay while the workers you lead are struggling?" The question was met with a loud chorus of boos and a small round of applause. Cirabella waved his hand to stop the boos. "That's a fair question," he said. He looked thoughtful. "The truth is that our situations are different. The strikers are seeking a decent wage and a fair contract. I have a contract with the union that guarantees me a decent wage. It is also the case that while the strike is on, the strikers are not working but my work increases.
So I am now working 80 and 90 hours a week for the same basic wage." There was a smattering of applause and a few sarcastic laughs from the anti-union corner. "So it's entirely reasonable that I continue to get my pay during the strike." Cirabella paused as though finished. Then he leaned forward. His voice rose, filling the auditorium. "But as a matter of conscience, so long as the strike continues, I refuse to touch a single penny. Everything I earn goes to the strike fund." The auditorium erupted in cheers. It did not surprise me that the strike was settled, on terms favorable to the union, shortly thereafter. In 1973, while Cirabella was focused on building Local 35, Here's President Ed S. Miller died. His successor was Ed Hanley, who came from the ethically challenged Chicago Local 1. Hanley did not seem likely to be an improvement. He was a Chicago bartender often accused of having links to organized crime. The Department of Justice later alleged that Hanley's election as president of the union was assisted by the Chicago crime boss Joey Aiuppa. Although Hanley denied the accusation, he regularly refused to testify about mob connections when questioned by congressional committees. But Hanley recognized that the union, after 20 years of leadership by Miller, was in bad shape. It was losing members, and it was doing little organizing. He had been quietly listening to Cirabella's message of change while Miller was notably absenting himself. 15 years later, Wilhelm recalled his surprise at Hanley's commitment to change. When he became the general president, the very first thing he said was, "We have to get rid of these old ways of doing things like organizing. They don't work anymore." Hanley authorized Cirabella to hire 4 new organizers for Local 217. And once again, Vinnie ignored the traditional patronage system and appointed people of unusual talent, including Carl Lecco, who went on to become the organizing director and international vice president, Morty Miller, who became the director of the Service Trades Council, a multi-union bargaining coalition.
Henry Tamarin, who was later elected president of Local 1 in Chicago, and Debbie Anderson, who is currently the coordinator of the union's airport program. As Cirabella's status in the union improved, his unhappiness with the leadership of HERE, with the exception of Ed Hanley, continued. I think that they get into these positions of authority, power, influence, comfort, large incomes, and all the other things, and they insulate themselves from any possibility of being deposed or even challenged. The lack of respect was mutual. As Sherry Chiesa, a Cirabella protege and now the union's secretary-treasurer, explained to me, they hated him because he was pushing them.
The labor movement had been resting on its laurels for a long time.
And Vincent told them, we've got to involve our members and we've got to be militant. Most of the leadership of the union had been around for 30 and 40 years. And frankly, they weren't doing anything. Well, Edward saw that. And I think he realized that without a Vincent Cirabella bringing along new, aggressive, young union leaders, the union was going to get its ass handed to it.
And at the same time Edward had to balance the fact that the majority of the executive board of the union and people in leadership positions came from the old guard.
In the mid-1970s, San Francisco was the gathering place for radical groups formed in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Restaurant work, with its shifting schedules, was a job that fit easily into their lifestyle. They believed in unionism but thought that most unions, including HERE, were either corrupt or too accommodating to employers. By the early 1980s, self-styled revolutionists began showing up at Local 2 meetings and demanding fundamental changes. To control the situation, Hanley appointed an old-time union functionary, Joseph Belardi, who came out of the Cooks Local to be president of Local 2. He was a poor choice, not well equipped to deal with the new, diverse makeup of the union. According to Mark Norton, who worked as a dishwasher at the time, during the Belardi administration, the maids were, for all practical purposes, viewed merely as the ladies' auxiliary. All the important power brokers came from the better-off crafts: cooks, bartenders, waiters, and some waitresses. Back in those days, these crafts were also much more white and much less immigrant than today. Those who were unhappy with Belardi and the conservative policies of the local formed an opposition group, the Alliance of Rank 53. Chapter 5: The Rejuvenation of HERE Local 2 and File, ARF. They quickly became a powerful force. In 1978, the members voted Belardi out and selected, in his stead, David McDonald, an eloquent, well-educated ARF leader.
The new leadership could do little. The executive committee was split among the various factions of the union, which essentially immobilized the local.
Negotiations with the major restaurant chains and hotels were about to begin, and the union had no coherent strategy. Members of the executive committee, including McDonald, asked Ed Hanley for help. Hanley called on Vinnie Cirabella. Vince, we got a pack of trouble out there in San Francisco. A bunch of radicals have taken over the union. I want you to go out there. You know how to deal with the left, you've dealt with them all your life. Hanley appointed Vinnie trustee of San Francisco Local 2. The ARF radicals, who had little knowledge of the union's history, saw a gray-haired, ethnic union official and assumed him to be a conservative bureaucrat. Vinnie the Bolshevik became Cirabella the fascist dictator. Here I am a stranger, and I walked into town filled with Maoists and Trotskyites. The Soviet supporters were considered the right-wingers out there. Every gradation of the left had their own caucus, their own newspaper, and they are all attacking me because I'm a racket guy that Hanley sent out there. All of a sudden, overnight, I'm a right-winger. I arrived there September 18, 1978, my wife's birthday, and I checked into the Hyatt Regency the night before and I walked to the Union from the Hyatt Hotel, and on the foundation of the building in red letters about 2 feet high was, Hanley and Cirabella, keep your hands off Local 2. That was my salutation. Welcome to San Francisco. Well, I walk in and I had arranged a meeting with the existing staff. I sat down with them and presented my credentials, my authority to take the union over. Within an hour I had a visit from 3 people from ARF. So I sat down and said, "Good morning, what can I do for you?" They said, "We don't want you in this city." I said, "You're not alone in that desire. However, I've been given an assignment and responsibility, which I'm going to carry out." I agreed to meet with their members. An hour later I get a call from the Gay Caucus. They came in, and they said, "We want to know what your position is on gays." I said, "It's very simple. If any employer tries to take advantage of your gayness in any way at all, I'll go right for their jugular. I don't care what you do in your sex life. That's your business. I don't care what you do. I have enough problems worrying about my sex problems without worrying about yours. And I gave them a large donation for their political action committee. But ARF stayed on the attack. They leafleted me in every hotel and restaurant, called me a racket guy, called me a fascist. Then they went to the Examiner and gave an interview to the Examiner and rapped the hell out of me. The next day Cirabella had a press conference. The first question set the tone. Mr.
Cirabella, it has been speculated that you have been sent here by the International Union to suppress the progressive elements in this union. There was no better way to rile Cirabella than to question his working-class credentials. I said, obviously you haven't checked my background. I said, I don't think a labor leader, any labor leader, can be anywhere but on the left side of the spectrum.
If you are on the right side, you really should be working for the Chamber of Commerce. However, I make a sharp distinction between the constructive left and the destructive left because the destructive left has a hidden agenda that collides squarely with the interest of the workers of this country. I said, and to the extent that there are destructive elements in Local 2, I will not only suppress them, I will extinguish them. After the press conference, Cirabella, as he had promised, met with the radicals. They went on the attack. How dare you talk like you did? I said, let's get something straight. I didn't learn my stuff in any college campus like you did. I have a PhD that I picked up in the gutter, sleeping in Salvation Army shelters since I was 13. I talked to you guys on Monday with clean hands. You gave me no chance. You went right after me yesterday and I'm not complaining about that, but don't complain about me going after you today. I don't care whether you're a Maoist or an Albanian or whatever you are. You're free to express any idea you want, but I got to pull this whole union together. It's falling apart, and those employers are up on top of the hill laughing at all of us, licking their chops, anticipating how they're going to grind us all up next year. I believe there will be an inevitable citywide industry strike next year. I welcome you, in spite of what you did to me yesterday, to join the team, but if you keep attacking me publicly, I'll cut your fucking ears right off your head. You take your pick. Cirabella began implementing his program of grassroots involvement immediately. Mark Norton recalled how different his operating style was from that of Bellardi. One of the key things he did was allow for an elected negotiating committee. That was brand new. We hadn't had anything remotely like that in anybody's memory. Those contracts had always been Bellardi and company went behind some door with the boss, they hammered something out, they came out and if they bothered to tell us what it was and said take it or leave it to you. So having an elected negotiating committee changed the dynamic. Quite a bit. And when they had the elections, the amazing thing is Cirabella's international-backed slate took about 50% of the seats on the negotiating committee for hotel contract and the continuing divided rank and file movement also took about 50%. So the contract negotiations became fascinating to use one word. During his period as trustee, Cirabella selected and trained shop stewards and called an election to select a citywide bargaining committee. There was a strike going on against Zim's, 12 restaurants citywide. I put the new rank-and-file bargaining committee on it. Finally, I get the settlement. Now the committee, including one guy who was part of ARF, votes unanimously to support the settlement, a Cadillac settlement. They couldn't do anything other than that. So I call a ratification meeting 2 days later. And they, ARF, go after me again, calling me a crook and a gangster and all this bullshit. When ARF tried to disrupt the meeting, Cirabella blew up at them. He announced to the membership, you either hear me explain the terms and give you an opportunity to vote on this, or I'll go upstairs to my office and sign it. If you want to listen to these crazy lefties out here, it's all right with me. We've got a unanimous recommendation on this thing here, including one of the guys from their group. If you want to stay on the street, go ahead, stay out there as long as you like. It's okay with me. Fortunately, sensible people took control and put them down and passed it in a breeze. Flo Douglas, who had been the head of the now-merged Waitresses Union, told Cirabella that to cement his support, he needed to appoint a woman as business agent. She suggested a recently hired clerk, Sherry Chiesa. Cirabella somewhat reluctantly agreed to interview her. Chiesa later recalled, he was tough, very tough. It was one of the scariest job interviews I ever went through. But to his credit, he gave me a chance. Just as Cirabella was gaining control, a federal judge dissolved the trusteeship and ordered new elections. By then, Cirabella had formed a highly favorable opinion of Chiesa. He suggested that she run for secretary-treasurer, the number 2 position in the union. She ran on a slate with Charles Lamb, one of the ARF members originally elected to the union's executive board. He was by then out of favor with the leadership of ARF. They were both elected. Citywide negotiations were scheduled to begin less than a year after the election. Neither Lamb nor Chiesa was an experienced negotiator. They knew they needed help, as Chiesa later recalled, so we asked Vincent to stick around and help us. And it is during that period that I basically would follow him around like a puppy and sit next to him and just watch him. I learned about negotiating by watching Vincent very closely. I also learned from him that organizing was what it was all about. We had to put that first, we had to be serious about it, we had to sacrifice for it. He just pounded that message of organizing, organizing, organizing. If you were around him at all, you got to see the wisdom of that and how true it was. They organized committees, including an elected bargaining committee, composed primarily of middle-of-the-road liberals, and asked Cirabella to stay on and negotiate their new contract with the hotel industry. He not only acted as principal negotiator but managed the predicted strike as well. The result was a major union victory, a 22% wage increase for the current year and substantial raises for the next 3 years. As Cirabella recounted. But the destructive left can't allow us to have this, because this derails their whole program. I'm in their way. They have a larger program, they have the international scene to worry about and all their dialectical bullshit in cells and caucuses. So now comes the big ratification meeting in the stadium. I got a call from the police intelligence a couple days before the meeting, anticipate trouble. Charlie Powelson was director of organization, and he said to me, "You need a bodyguard out there. That's a rough town right now." I said, "What am I going to do with a bodyguard? If somebody wants to kill you, how do you stop them? I'll take my chances." I mean, it was such a good contract. No one was going to turn it down. They, the radicals, were supposed to be the champions of the maids. I delivered for the maids. Hell, they got 35% in 2 months. I began to explain the terms of the contract, and I wanted to be as precise as I could. Charlie, the president of the union, and I were the only two on the platform, and we both got bombarded with eggs. The second thing they did, they lit firecrackers in the hall. Hundreds of people were terrified, they thought some shooting was going on. Anyway, we got through that somehow, and I continued the explanation of the contract. After further confrontations, the contract was ratified overwhelmingly. In the aftermath of the meeting and vote, Cirabella was interviewed by the press outside the stadium, and then all of a sudden, I got hit in the eye. I was in shock, and then there was all this fluid on my face. I instinctively tried to brush it away and realized that I was bleeding. That was the lead story on the television that night. And that was the beginning of the end for the destructive left. By the time I left, I had strong support from the rank and file. Chiesa admits that the entire episode remains controversial within the still radical San Francisco labor community. It's a very controversial strike to this day, with lots of disagreement in our membership about whether we won or lost. I believe we won. We certainly got significant improvements in the contract. Where the dispute comes was how much improvement did we have prior to the strike as opposed to post-strike. My view of this is that our membership was so angry that it didn't matter what the contract was, we had to have a strike. Because the workers were just up in arms about the way they were treated. So, I view it as a very cathartic thing that had to happen. I think the strike was transforming for our membership. Some of the Yale organizers, including John Wilhelm, Henry Tamarin, Carl LaChow, and Debbie Anderson, traveled to San Francisco to help out with the strike. They discovered, according to John Wilhelm, that the sectarian left factions in Local 2 were more interested in fighting with each other and with the International Union than they were in fighting the employers. It was the housekeepers and kitchen workers who patrolled the picket lines. The new, controversial agreement was signed in 1981 and expired in 1984. Controversy over the 1980 strike kept the union divided and its members angry. In 1984, new negotiations began with the restaurant industry. Another strike occurred, one that almost everyone agrees the union lost disastrously. In 1985, in the wake of the strike, Chiesa was elected president of Local 2. She explained how it happened. There were 7 candidates for president and 5 full slates running. And I just determined that I was going to be straightforward and not lie to people. Most candidates were running around saying vote for me and you won't have a strike. I was not saying that. I was saying vote for us. We're gonna get organized. We're gonna go back to grassroots. In fact, my campaign was called Back to Basics. It was, let's get organized. Then whether or not we strike, you guys are gonna make that decision. The members were receptive to that, and I won the election. So we organized the membership to win. That's how I won. So I become president, and I am facing this enormous challenge with the hotels because the hotels saw us on the brink of getting destroyed by the restaurants, and they figure they were going to put the nail in the coffin. And I decided that I'm in over my head. I don't have enough experience to deal with this. And I asked President Hanley to send me help. And he sent me, God bless him, John Wilhelm. And John worked with me through that whole thing. We won the greatest contract, it was spectacular. It was the greatest experience of my labor career. It was Chiesa who conducted the negotiations, with strategic help from Wilhelm and Jeff Fiedler. The hotels were appreciating in value hugely, so the hotels would come into negotiations and say occupancy is down and we're not making enough money, so we can't give you what you're asking for. So John and Jeff Fiedler came up with this idea in which we put a proposal on the table, which was all about, okay, we don't want a wage increase. All we want is our piece of the appreciation of the hotel, and the press ate it up. I mean, these hotels were appreciating by 200% in a year. It was just unbelievable. And so that was really one of the things that caught the hotel's eyes. But bottom line is, all the tactics and all that aside, the only reason we could carry it out is because we organized the members, and that was what was different from the 1984 strike. Cirabella's impact on the union was well summed up by Mark Norton, one of his longtime opponents. He made sure that the International remained in charge. That was his assigned task, and that was Hanley and all he represented. On the other hand, he certainly had a more struggle-oriented view of what needed to happen here. It wasn't to the point that I thought we needed or could have done, but he was more interested in fighting with the bosses than Belardi was. He also understood, and this was really the beginning of the fundamental change in Local 2 in the period I've been around. He understood that the leadership of the union had to base itself not just on the most privileged members, the white guys in the fancy restaurants and the bartenders and such, but it had to root itself first and foremost among the room cleaners and the dishwashers and the stewards and the people in the back of the house. Thereafter, Local 2 became one of the most active organizing locals in the union, using Cirabella's combination of worker activism and alliances with progressive forces. Chiesa herself advanced from leadership role to leadership role, becoming a member of the union's executive board, first as vice president and then as general secretary, once Jerry Sullivan's position. Cirabella's ability to achieve gains and focus the membership on union priorities led to his appointment in 1983 as director of organizing for the union. 60. When Ed Hanley appointed Vinnie Cirabella Western Regional Director of HERE in 1980, it left a vacancy at Local 35, and Hanley, acting on Cirabella's enthusiastic recommendation, appointed John Wilhelm chief business agent. Soon after his appointment, Wilhelm, strongly supported by the members of Local 35, began an organizing campaign among Yale's clerical and technical workers, creating a new Local 34 to represent them. 1. Organizing the clerical workers was bound to be a formidable task. The bargaining unit that the union sought was large, somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 employees. It was diverse, including secretarial workers, librarians, journal editors, science technicians, and employees of Yale University Press. The workforce was dispersed throughout the many different schools, departments, bureaus, centers, and research groups. They had no history of solidarity. They were divided by skill level, salary, status, and job satisfaction. There had never been a successful organizing effort in a similar unit. Wilhelm's organizing team was small, consisting only of 4 organizers at first and then 2 more. 2 The model for their previous or Chapter 6 organizing Yale's clerical and technical workers. Organizing efforts was fairly simple. It was described to me by Ellen Thompson, one of the Local 217 organizers, as, find leaders, get a committee, have them understand what the union is about, prepare them for what an employer would say about union corruption, dues, and strikes, train them to talk and organize. The organizers of Local 34 quickly found that their previous tactics were not adequate to the task at Yale. As Thompson explained, there was no model for organizing 2,700 people in 200 separate buildings in offices of 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Our model was based on hotels where there are lots of people talking to each other, so the ratios were different. At Yale, if you got something exciting going in one building, it's not like it spread like wildfire across the campus. So the numbers and the ratios we contemplated were way off. Committees had to be much larger and stronger. There had to be this huge organizing committee. If there were 4 people in an office, there had to be someone on the committee. The organizers reveled in the realization that they were breaking new ground. According to Thompson, people used to joke about where's the book, what does the next page say? Well, there was no book. We were writing it. The role assigned to the employee activists went well beyond that common to members of internal organizing committees. Wilhelm explained. We, out of necessity, developed the idea of a steering committee. We realized that we had to have people beyond the organizers who took greater responsibility and met every week, which they still do, and coordinated the organizing committee, which in turn would work with the workers, and that didn't turn out to be enough either. We eventually developed what we referred to as the rank and file staff, which meets every week or every 2 weeks, depending, and which now numbers 65 people who really are organizers. Lee Berman was one of those early recruits. I was brought on by one of the paid organizers. She pulled me forward. In fact, in this union one thing that happens is that you can be catapulted to great heights within a small amount of time. I came on in August, and in November I'm speaking at a big rally. It's crazy. There was a reason that I became involved then and didn't earlier, and that was because I realized that this was a very different organizing drive, and I have seen some of the others and they just weren't the same. They weren't built from the bottom up like this union was. I really liked the organizers, and I understood that what they were working for was something they could be proud of. And I loved organizing. I really enjoyed watching women, particularly, stand up for themselves. One of the union's most effective tactics was comparing salaries of the unionized maintenance workers, overwhelmingly male, with those of the non-unionized clerical and technical workers, overwhelmingly female. Berman told me, it wasn't until we started looking at differences within the C&T, clerical and technical, unit that I realized that there was a real discrimination going on. I don't think I came into this whole thing thinking that there was any particular discrimination against women. I thought it was against the group as a whole. The drive did not become public until the union had secured authorization cards from more than a majority of the clerical and technical workers. The cards were hard-won. Instead of stressing, as many unions did at the time, that a signed authorization card would be used only to get an election, Local 34 emphasized its significance. Wilhelm told me, we actually have a printed piece of paper that we gave out with the authorization cards that said, do not sign this card unless you've decided that you want to have a union. When they had cards signed by a majority of the clerical and technical employees, the union filed a petition with the NLRB seeking a representation election. Once the petition was filed, clerical workers all over campus showed up wearing union buttons, many of which announced their status as members of one or another union committee. Shortly thereafter, the university administration hired the firm of Siegel and O'Connor to help defeat the union. 3.
Siegel and O'Connor began with a standard management tactic, raising numerous objections to the union's proposed unit.
This commonly used technique has two purposes, delay and disruption. Delay is known to help dissipate a union majority, and disruption weakens the union in the event of a strike. Local 34 countered by bringing members of the bargaining unit to the hearing and publicizing both the University Council's tactics and the employees' reactions. For example, in February 1983 the union distributed a handout that included a transcript of the hearing and the following employee responses. I found the hearing extremely degrading. Watching the university stall our rights is disgraceful. Yale was condescending, manipulative, devious, and outright insulting to the clericals and technicals. Not once would they meet our eyes. It is increasingly evident that Yale is using every possible stalling technique. What the university may not realize, however, is that every day these hearings are prolonged, more and more support for the union is growing. The effect of these statements, which were distributed campus-wide, was dramatic. It increased the feeling that many clerical workers had that they were disrespected by the university administration. After a few weeks of constant attacks,
in union handouts, University Council caved in and accepted the unit as described by the union.
This turned out to be very helpful to the union. 4. This tactic was used for the first time in the Yale campaign. Wilhelm was surprised by its success. We sort of happened on it. It never occurred to us before to actually use the NLRB bullshit as an organizing device. It never crossed our minds, and we stumbled onto it by accident, and boy did that work. Another innovation was the Declaration of Independence poster. 6 days before the election, the union plastered the entire campus, during the night, with 3-foot-tall cardboard posters designed to resemble the Declaration of Independence. The poster declared in bold letters, "We believe in ourselves." Below was a paragraph in smaller type. As clerical and technical employees at Yale, we believe that our work is vital to the success of Yale's mission. By joining together in our union, we can achieve our rightful place as equal members of the Yale community. To the side and below the text were over 1,000 signatures. The care with which the signatures were written made clear that the signers believed they were doing something to be proud of. This technique, according to Wilhelm, came from another union. I got that idea from someone who put out a much smaller version on a little sort of a scroll in a state organizing campaign here in Connecticut. I thought it was a really great idea. With all its special tactics, the heart of the union campaign was the testimony of its members. From the start, the organizers undertook to inspire potential leaders to speak out publicly. This was a delicate task. Most of those recruited had never been activists of any kind and certainly not spokespeople for a controversial cause. They had previously worked in the shadows of their superiors. They demurred at first, but when they actually found themselves stepping forward, most of the activists found the experience exhilarating. As Andrea Ross, whose life was permanently changed by the experience, told me at the time, there were times when they pushed me to do things that I felt were difficult or didn't want to do. Like this building, where there's this group of anti-union people. They were extremely hostile, and it was much easier for me to ignore them and speak to people who were receptive, but an organizer was pushing me and we went in there and had a couple of major arguments and afterwards I felt very good that I did it, and the next time it wasn't quite so difficult. The union's rallies had a quasi-religious flavor. Members testified about their failures, temptations, and ultimate redemption through solidarity. When Local 34's president, the eloquent Lucille Dickus, described how she had fought unionism in the past and how she had become converted by realizing that university officials did not truly respect her, people wept, cheered, and stood up to applaud her. The sense of being inadequately respected was widespread, and it fueled the organizing drive. Many of us felt that we were the invisible part of the Yale community, there to do the work without which the university couldn't function, but overlooked, ignored, voiceless. 5. The emotion of the meetings affected the organizers, too. Paul Clifford, a Yale graduate who currently leads the union's Toronto local, told me that, "I was moved to tears at every single big meeting we had." A feminist secretary wrote of similar reactions. "I was brought to tears more than once by the eloquence and fire of some of the women's speeches, and the feeling of massive support for making women's lives better." The enthusiasm for this struggle was evident from long rounds of cheers and applause and standing ovations from the crowds of women and men. I was inspired and filled with a sense of purpose that provided a kind of political renewal for me, the seasoned feminist. 6. Both paid organizers and members of the Inside Organizing Committee told me that the experience of working together changed them in a deep and lasting way. The change was most vividly described to me by Clifford. "I really think of it in very personal terms. How people changed personally and how I changed personally and how there's now an incredible intangible bond of solidarity. For me it was a changing of class.
I grew up in an upper-middle-class professional family, and I've thrown my line in with working people, and that's where my identification is, and I don't identify with the students at Yale University, and I don't identify with the faculty.
I can get along, and I know how people think and everything like that, but I really identify with the people who work for the university and the people who live in the city of New Haven, and not with the people who run Yale University or try to push around the city of New Haven. That's the change that I've gone through, and it's something that I'm not going to go back on." In January 1983, just before the NLRB election, Yale University President A. Bartlett Giamatti issued a statement in which he claimed that unionization would disrupt the structure of relationships created between the members of the staff and the university. It would be an additional threat to the collegial spirit that animates this place. At the union's urging, the noted labor historian David Montgomery and I prepared a response with the help of two law students, Cindy Esland and Sam Isaacaroff. 7 In our statement, we declared that the administration's so-called fact books are filled with distortions, misleading innuendo, and mischaracterizations about unions and collective bargain. We are especially disappointed that the administration has acted as though the very idea of collective bargaining were a menace to the collegiality of the university community. We concluded that it was embarrassing to witness the university's use of its reputation for scholarly excellence for such an ignoble end. The union distributed our response to the voters. The election was held in May 1983. Hundreds of union supporters attended the final vote count in one of Yale's auditoriums. The vote was close, and the count seesawed back and forth. When the Union victory was ultimately signaled by John Wilhelms putting his hands over his head, the workers cheered, cried, stamped their feet, and chanted, "Union! Union! Union!" over and over. It was a notable victory and received a great deal of favorable publicity. Clerical workers had never before been unionized at an elite academic institution. Wilhelm was portrayed as a master strategist in many articles. But he himself came away with a sense of how much he had learned and how little understanding there was in the ranks of organized labor about the relationship between workers and organizers. I think that we have a much better understanding of what the function of the organizer actually is, which is not to organize the workers at all but to train the rank and file leaders. It's a commentary on the movement's lack of focus on organizing that we had to learn. People should know that and pass it on. There have to be some isolated individuals who know these things, but nobody asks them. I'm proud of what we've done and I'm not trying to engage in false modesty here, but there are unquestionably people here and there who know some of these things. It raises an interesting historical question, why we don't know about them. One of the reasons for this is that the McCarthy period chased out a lot of people who might have withstood the complacency that developed. Wilhelm was also slightly embarrassed by the fact that the organizing drive had taken far longer than any of the original planners had anticipated. Clifford and Heyman originally came to work for us on the theory that it would take 6 months and they weren't doing anything else, so we paid them $10 a week, and that was 2 or 2.5 years ago. We made horrendous miscalculations with respect to how long this would take. Despite the drive's success, there was an important warning signal in the closeness of the vote. The organizing drive had many things going for it that are absent during a typical NLRB representation campaign. University officials were restrained in opposing the union. They made no threats and fired no one on the organizing committee. The organizers assigned to the campaign were unusually talented and were able to make use of long-term town resentment against the university. The rank and file committees were made up of talented, articulate, and committed workers. The effort had the support of many faculty and feminist groups. Yet even with all of that, the union barely won. Why, despite low wages and minimum benefits, did so many clerical workers vote no? The answer is not fear of university reprisal. I was there, and I spoke with enough clerical workers, both pro and anti-union, to feel certain of that. Nor was the union hampered by lack of access to employees. They were able to conduct open meetings and take part in debates. The no votes were, I believe, based on a variety of attitudes often present among workers when an organizing drive takes place. Some workers were anti-union because of their own experience or that of relatives. Many were proud of working for Yale and did not want to do anything to damage its reputation or harm its mission. Some were content with their lives and jobs and were fearful of change. Some felt somehow ignored by the union. Some feared that their own status would be undermined by a union victory. In the aftermath of the vote, the union carefully forged its bargaining proposals through one-on-one conversations and the circulation of 2 rounds of surveys to all clerical and technical workers, union members and non-members alike, asking which issues they considered most important. Almost 2,000 employees responded, including many who were not yet union members. This open procedure for drawing up the contract produced a significant upsurge in membership. 8. The administration's negotiating style with Local 34 was confrontational.
During bargaining sessions, it treated the union not as a negotiating partner but rather as a naive entity that required education.
As a result, the negotiations had less a sense of give and take than a sense of lecture and response. At one point, the union took the bold step of inviting members of the Yale faculty to attend the negotiations as adjuncts to the union's bargaining committee. I was one of those who took part. Like my colleagues, I was dismayed at the condescending and arrogant tone and style of argument used by administration spokespeople. I was at the time the principal negotiator for the Connecticut State Police Union. I know something about rough and tumble negotiating, but none of the state negotiators that I dealt with would have used the tone of moral and intellectual superiority routinely used by Yale's spokespeople. After a series of bargaining sessions failed to produce an agreement, a strike deadline was set for April 4, 1984. The union called a meeting for that afternoon. In the meantime, however, Wilhelm came up with a novel alternative, a partial contract that would contain all the terms already agreed to by the bargainers. The advantage to the union would be twofold. First, the new contract would lock in benefits already offered. Second, and most important, it would prevent a strike from happening at a time when the union's ability to apply economic pressure was limited because of the coming summer vacation, when many areas of the university basically shut down anyway. The union made the proposal, and the administration accepted. Most observers expected that an agreement would be reached over the summer, but the parties were deadlocked over wages. In September 1984, the strike began. The administration was in a strong position. The union did not attempt to shut down the university. Classes were taught, although some of us found ways to teach off campus so that we did not cross the picket line. Professors were free to go to their offices, students to classes and dorms. While the university went about its business, the union members were out in the increasingly cold Connecticut air waving their picket signs. These were poor people who needed their pay and weren't getting it. Inevitably, some of the clerical and technical workers began to cross the picket line, some because they disapproved of the strike, some because they needed the money, and some because they thought the situation hopeless. In the end, the greatest harm to the university's operations came from the Local 35 service and maintenance workers, who honored the picket line and did not show up for work. The union's leaders had earlier come to the conclusion that winning the strike could not be accomplished merely through the withdrawal of services. As explained by senior organizer Carl Lachow, after the election victory, I took a walk with John around the New Haven Green. The first thing that we discussed was the fact that we were never going to be able to get an excellent contract based on the withdrawal of service alone. The key to success, they agreed, was to strike at Yale's reputation, which was one reason for the union's repeated claims of sex discrimination. The union distributed buttons that read, 65 cents, with a line through it.
These buttons were meant to emphasize studies at the time showing that women on average earn 35 cents an hour less than men. The union also represented truck drivers, and all its spokespeople made clear that the appeal for pay equity was not an attack on the salaries of the men, whom the union insisted were worth every penny they get. By the middle of the strike, if not earlier, the union's expressions of solidarity with the members of Local 35, whose members steadfastly refused to cross the picket line throughout the strike, were obviously heartfelt. The union also made an effort to enlist support from members of the Yale Corporation, the board that oversees the university. 2 board members were feminists. Eleanor Holmes Norton, a former head of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and a member of the faculty of Georgetown Law School, and Deborah Rhode, a Yale Law School graduate and professor at Stanford Law School. 9 Norton, a prominent political figure, was the union's main target. Among those whom the union enlisted in this effort was Jeff Fiedler, a researcher and strategist for the Food and Allied Service Trades Department of the AFL-CIO. Fiedler, who had developed a reputation as a master tactician, tried to shame Norton into pressuring Giamatti to settle. LeChao believed that Norton was getting ready to resign from the board when the strike was settled. This is not clear, but Fiedler's unorthodox tactics and his willingness to take on tough chores endeared him to Wilhelm. They became friends during the strike and have worked together effectively ever since. The union extended the reach of the strike beyond Yale to wherever the trustees were. As described to me by LeChao at the time, "We went down to Brown Brothers, which is Madden's, a member of the Yale Corporation Bank, the biggest investment bank in the United States, and we leafleted the investment bank.
We leafleted all the secretaries. We went around the halls with a leaflet saying, 'You are in the same boat that we're in. Madden has stepped on both of us. Call this number and we'll help you organize.' And we got 40 calls, and he went nuts. He was extremely upset. There were some things we did on the investment level which were just a pain in the ass to them. We would hold up certain investments, transactions of $10 million or more, by having proxy votes. All this let them know that we were going to extend the fight beyond the walls of Yale. They would not be able to leave New Haven and leave their worries behind. We would call our locals in Cincinnati, in Los Angeles and New York and Chicago, everywhere, and we'd picket the Yale clubs. We followed Reverend Moore, another member of the Yale Corporation, out to Louisiana. He was giving a speech to the bishops down there, and we had a group of 15 or 20 black workers leaflet all the bishops down there, and he was completely embarrassed. The strike became the main topic of conversation on campus and a source of meetings, debates, rallies, and class discussion. Supportive faculty organized into a group that called itself Faculty in Support of Local 34. It included some of Yale's ablest scholars. But Paul Clifford was not happy with the very modest level of support that came from the faculty, even those who thought of themselves as radicals. As he explained to me, "I got personally pissed off at people when the strike began. People who I would have expected to speak out or to do something more active were suddenly overcome by a sort of academic paralysis. I know their thinking was that they had done everything they liberally could in terms of writing letters and making polite noises, and so then when the strike began, folks said, 'It's not appropriate for us to do anything more, because, if we act in another manner, then we're changing the way this place runs, and we don't want to do that.' In accordance with the union's basic strategy, it was not the faculty and not Wilhelm or LeChao but Local 34 members Lucille Dickus, Deborah Kernoff, and Andrea Ross who were regularly quoted in the New York Times. It was Lucille Dickus who effectively debated President Giamatti on the Phil Donahue show. This was a bit of theater that the union staff recognized could only help them. As explained to me by LeChao, it was a plus, an unquestionable A+. It made no difference who won. Giamatti is up against a C&T, clerical and technical worker. A well-known academic all-star with all sorts of degrees is debating Lucille Dickus, registrar in the Geology and Geophysics department at Yale, a 50-year-old lady who worked at Yale for 10 years, very nice-spoken. She didn't beat him on the debate. No way did she beat him. But he lost hands down. To attract publicity to the strike, the union regularly used celebrities, well-known feminist and civil rights leaders. It employed civil disobedience, mass rallies, and candlelight vigils in addition to traditional picketing. On October 16, 190 strikers were arrested for blocking a public road during a silent protest outside the president's home. A week later, the union conducted an even larger protest action. Over 400 people, including students and some faculty, were arrested as a crowd of over 1,000 watched. This massive turnout would not have been possible without the organizers' earlier careful, painstaking work on developing a sense of ownership of the union and the strike among the clerical workers. The large-scale civil disobedience was the subject of a feature article in the New York Times. The headline read, "Police arrest 430 at Yale protest in support of striking employees. 10 The participation of the civil rights leaders Bayard Rustin and the Reverend Ralph Abernathy was featured in the Times story. Bayard Rustin, who was granted an honorary degree by Yale last year for his activism in civil rights, led the silent protest. I believe that having been made a part of the Yale community by receiving an honorary degree, I am here not by choice but because I have a moral obligation, Mr. Rustin said. The Rev. Ralph Abernathy addressed the protesters in New Haven's First Methodist Church before the demonstration. Abernathy's participation, not expected by the union when the action was planned, was, according to Lachow, a key moment in the strike. Despite the adverse publicity, the university continued to insist that it had made its final proposal. Some of the strikers began to fear for their jobs. With Christmas approaching, the union announced a return to work.
They described the action as home for the holidays. The union also announced its intention of resuming the strike after the holiday season.
Wilhelm referred to the cessation as bringing the strike inside. Many of us thought that the cessation was an act of weakness, a sign that the strike was lost. Yet it was during this period that the strike was settled on terms quite favorable to the union. University officials, I later learned, were very concerned with the threat of the workers returning but engaging in slowdowns and other job actions with no end in sight. They were aware that most of the strikers, who had stayed out for almost 4 months, had a deep commitment to the union. University officials were right to be worried. Wilhelm was serious about the inside strike. What he wanted to achieve was the commitment and some of the effect of a strike without forcing the union's members to give up salary and to risk losing their jobs to strike replacements. If you can get the rank and file membership of the union to do all the kinds of things that they did while on strike, and have the same level of commitment and urgency about it, but also report to work, I think you can achieve great power. Personally, I was in favor of guerrilla warfare, intermittent strikes. That's one of the reasons I liked the partial contract. Selling the idea of a return to work to the strikers was not easy, and Wilhelm would not have considered using the tactic if it had not been approved by the membership. The nature of the internal debate was captured in a New York Times article. Local 34 voted on November 29 to return to work. The proposal had surfaced 2 weeks earlier. At first, rank-and-file picketers overwhelmingly opposed it, saying it represented a retreat. But, by the night of the meeting, enough members had changed their minds, after picket line debates, to pass the proposal, 800 to 250. Many members said that the novelty of the proposal made it difficult to assess at first, but that they grew excited about forging new ground.
I cried when I first heard about it, an administrative assistant, Carol Johnson, said. I screamed and kept my husband up all night.
But by Wednesday, they convinced me of the logic of it. Some people were still angry, but they'll be all right, Mrs. Johnson added. That's how it is with our union. 11. Because the union victory happened at Yale, because prominent people were involved and spoke out, and because the victory occurred at a time when union victories were few and far between, the strike and settlement received a great deal of publicity. And the victory helped propel a whole group of Cirebella's protégés into higher positions in the union. 72. In 1983 here President Ed Hanley named Vinnie Cirebella to the position of Director of Organizing of the International Union. It was Cirebella's longtime dream come true. 1 He had since the 1960s preached the central importance of grassroots organizing to skeptical union officials. Now he would be able to put his ideas into action. Cirebella anticipated success. He had developed an approach to organizing that seemed foolproof. Between 1979 and 1985, relying on Cirebella's committee-centered strategy, Local 217 won 11 consecutive NLRB elections. In almost every case, the local won despite the efforts of a union-busting consultant to defeat it. John Wilhelm told me at the time that he welcomed campaigns against management consultants because he knew in almost every case exactly what they would do. Cirebella immediately began planning a major national organizing drive. He offered Wilhelm the position of second in command of the drive, but Wilhelm declined because of family commitments. The position was then offered to Karl Lachow, whom both Cirebella and Wilhelm recognized as a superb field organizer. A number of the Experi Chapter 7 the need for a new organizing model. Ernst Yale organizers were enlisted in the effort, among them Morty Miller, Paul Clifford, and Joe Marie Agrieste. Cirebella also placed ads in newspapers all over the country similar to the one that first attracted Wilhelm. An impressive group of young, liberal, mostly college-educated activists responded. Cirebella grilled the applicants and came away enthusiastic, convinced that those he chose were intelligent, committed to the rights of workers, and empathetic. He was right. Most were destined for important leadership roles in the union, among them D. Taylor, a waiter and student from Washington, D.C., who now leads the Culinary Workers Union in Las Vegas. The newcomers were given a crash course in Cirebella's approach to organizing, which stressed the importance of the internal organizing committee. The motto, "The organizer organizes the committee," and the committee organizes the workers, became as familiar to them as the Pledge of Allegiance. Actual field organizing began in early 1986 with great fanfare. However, by 1989, when I interviewed Cirabella on the status of the organizing program, he was quite depressed. The major goals of the drive were not being achieved. The union won a few elections, mainly for cafeteria workers at universities and federal buildings. But it had not won a single election at a hotel.
Vinny initially accepted the blame for the failure. I made a fundamental blunder, and that was relying on the model we developed in Connecticut over the years, particularly the Yale University white-collar drive. He also concluded that the young organizers were not prepared for the fierce employer resistance that they encountered. When, for example, the organizers left there, they left with this feeling that they could organize anything, which was a good feeling, but nonetheless it wasn't realistic when carried to the arena of the real fights, the real battles. And he concluded that he had sent the organizers out too soon. I can see there's no substitute for experience.
I don't care how many colleges they went through or how many degrees, you got to go through it like anything else. He also blamed union politics for the failure. When these kids went out into the city, they learned some of the political facts of life, that not every one of these local union leaders welcomed us. Moreover, some of their staffs were uneasy about these kids being around for fear they might take their job in some unknown way. We had all kinds of political impediments that we ran into in these cities almost uniformly. Our guys come in and immediately the staff feels threatened before we even suggest anything because they have worked twice as hard, twice as long, at half or one-third the money. They say, "What is this?" They call them Moonies, all kinds of things. Not in any pejorative sense, but nevertheless it is a criticism. So you have all of that to deal with. And we have had to take it from friend and foe alike. One hotel, the Tremont in Chicago, was organized during the process.
The comprehensive campaign that organized the Tremont was developed with the aid of Jeff Fiedler of the Food and Allied Service Trades, FAST Department of the AFL-CIO, who worked with Cirabella during the national organizing drive. Fiedler came up with an unusual, situation-driven tactic that permitted Cirabella to organize the Tremont Hotel in Boston without an NLRB election. Fiedler discovered through intensive research that the owner of the hotel, John Coleman, had substantial debts that he could not easily pay. I said to Rich McCracken, a lawyer for both here and FAST, I want to send letters to these 400 people we know that he owes money to. Can I call this thing a creditors committee even though we're not in bankruptcy? McCracken said, yeah, sure. And I sent a letter out. I said, hey, look, he owes you, he owes us, why don't we get together and get our money? My staff does these 400 envelopes, and then a couple weeks later they say, Jeff, did you get any answers? I say no. So it failed. I said no. What do you mean? I said, you think anyone wants to sell on 10 cents on the dollar with us? They are all going after him for 100% of their money. John Coleman then declared bankruptcy with $180 million in bills and $400 million of assets, none of which were liquid. He calls up Vincent and says, I'm fucking done. And Vincent and I go over to the Jockey Club in New York and negotiate the contract. And I'll never forget this as long as I live. Coleman turns to me and says, you're a goddamn terrorist. I said, no, John, you just thought we were stupid. It was a notable victory that might have served as a model for future organizing. But Cirabella initially discounted its significance because of the young organizers' failure to establish a strong committee structure. Although we organized the Tremont Hotel in Chicago, through a comprehensive campaign, we could never have won an election, even though we had somewhere in the neighborhood of the high 60% of the workers signed up. But at any event, we had no committee in the Tremont. And therefore we couldn't petition for an election. It would have been a loser. The workers would have caved in. Fortunately, we found a vulnerable area to attack the company. And we went at it. And he caved and he recognized us. But in terms of trying, for example, to follow what we did at Yale, it wasn't working. Since Cirabella was committed to the central role of worker committees, he saw the Tremont victory as something of a fluke, a reaction that disappointed. Fiedler. Vincent never got the full implications. Fiedler also thought that Cirabella underestimated the importance of research. However, even toward the end of Cirabella's career, Fiedler recognized that his instincts were extraordinary. D. Taylor attributed the failure of the organizing campaign to Cirabella's failure to depart from the NLRB election model that Local 217 had employed so successfully and also to his rush to get the organizers out in the field. I think he underestimated the length of time that it takes to get skilled organizers, and we did not do a comprehensive campaign in these.
We did not use corporate campaigns. And we didn't use political power. In order to organize a whole company, you've got to use all the tools, which we didn't use. We just basically organized the workers to take on these gigantic companies, and that's not a fair fight. Taylor's analysis would be accepted by most union organizing experts today. It is surprising that Cirabella, who had worked so patiently with Wilhelm and Lachau, rushed this new cadre into action prematurely and that he failed, except on one occasion, to use the valuable comprehensive campaign approach that he had pioneered. Perhaps, by then in his late 60s, he was feeling the pressure of aging, a desire to achieve something momentous before he became too old or too ill. Perhaps the early victories of Local 217 through board elections and the victory at Yale made him imagine that the process was easier than it turned out to be. He later concluded that he was too focused on finding another Wilhelm from outside the ranks of organized labor. This was against everything I stand for, he told me early in 1990.2. By then, the drive was gradually moving away from its NLRB focus. In the late summer of 1987, Cirabella gathered his team of organizers together in Las Vegas to discuss the state of the organizing drive and to come up with a series of organizing principles. Before the union could move forward, it would need to form a large internal organizing committee of at least 15% of the membership, within 90 days, and 20% would be even better. When the team tried to organize Washington's historic Willard Hotel, they were unable to put together an adequate committee within the 90-day period. Cirabella scrapped the effort. And at that point, he became angry with his team of organizers. The 82nd day, and we're at 12%, then. We're picking up garbage. These are superstars, so-called. Self-proclaimed superstars. I even said to them that our national program is in jeopardy because of their fucking egos. They were afraid to fail. They were afraid to lose their reputation for greatness. In general, the late 1980s were not a good time for Cirabella. He was in ill health, suffering from diabetes and heart trouble that would soon kill him. His anger, once a weapon that he could use selectively, was now more generally aimed at anyone who troubled him, from hotel waiters to union officials to his hand-picked organizers. He was furious with Wilhelm, who refused his entreaties to move to Washington as his primary assistant. He accused Lachau of betraying him and refused to shake hands with Taylor. His anger saddened many of the union's leaders. I have found no one who believed that his anger was justified but, curiously, no one who lost admiration for him. Typical was Rich McCracken's comment. I think that he was suffering from the illness that killed him when he became so angry at John. Cirabella did eventually recognize that the Tremont success was an important first step toward a new approach to organizing, an approach that combined worker committees with comprehensive campaign tactics. Point 4. But by then, the national organizing project was over. It is quite possible that the organizing drive, had it continued for much longer, would have shifted from NLRB-centered organizing to pressure for neutrality agreements and card check recognition. Such a shift was evident in the final effort of the drive to organize a new Marriott hotel in San Francisco. The effort began when Cirabella was notified by the president of Local 2 in San Francisco that the union had leverage with Marriott. He came close but never succeeded in organizing it using a new approach that the union would later refine. Cirabella explained. He tells me there's a hotel site in the Moscone Center down in San Francisco, and Marriott is bidding for it. Marriott has hired Willie Brown, Speaker of the House in California, as their local counsel, and we have the juice on the redevelopment. They can't get it without Local 2's okay. And he said, I'm willing to make a deal with this guy in a contract. I said, hold it Charlie, that's not enough. He said, what do you mean it's not enough? Because you never get the cards, that's why. We need more than that. So I went out there and sat down with him, and they brought the senior vice president in from Bethesda, and they had to make a decision in 48 hours, so I said, this isn't enough. He said, what do you need? I said, neutrality. He said, what's that? I said, you pledge no interference because if you get involved, we can't win.
You hire the people, you bring them in, you pound the shit out of them, we can't win, so where are we?
One of the final acts in Cirabella's organizing campaign was a meeting in Washington, D.C., in which he asked the new organizers to submit a systematic plan for completing the organization of the Marriott Hotel in San Francisco. What the young organizers came up with indicated how much they had learned about the complex process of organizing. Their ideas were imaginative and involved both the workforce and the general community, a far cry from the traditional hotshot model. Taylor suggested planting submarines in the workforce and efforts to obtain a pledge of neutrality from Marriott. In support of this, he suggested seeking mayoral support and a city council resolution regarding non-interference of the company. Morty Miller also suggested a broad neutrality agreement and that the union seek the company's cooperation through the Local 2 hiring hall. Warren Heyman suggested that the union recruit Local 2 members to apply for jobs in the hotel. Lisa Jakes, an international union organizer, called for an outreach program in which union members would contact the friends and families of other unions members. Catholic churches in the Mission District, black churches, New College, San Francisco State University, and City College of San Francisco, and Democratic clubs like the Chinese American Democratic Club, Harvey Milk Lesbian and Gay Democratic Club, Alice B. Toklas LGBT Democratic Club, and the Latino and the Roots. 5 There were many more new ideas, and they were all thorough, thoughtful, and interesting. The union was now staffed with a cadre of organizing experts, and it was ready to employ a variety of tactics, some new and some old but rarely used. It took many years for these ideas to come to fruition, but almost 10 years after Cirabella's death, the hotel became unionized. Cirabella continued to refine his thinking during this frustrating period.
He became convinced that the union needed to expand its campaigns from one-on-one battles with particular hotels to broader battles with the major companies. If we take on a Sheraton in City A, one-on-one, we can't win if they do what they normally do these days, but if they take us on, whether it's collective bargaining or an organizing drive or a strike, we've got to hit them in as many cities around the US simultaneously as we can.
We have to search those properties. We have to inform the coalition. We have to do a lot of things to bring that kind of pressure. Now, in addition to which, if we could hit 10 countries abroad who have Sheratons, and connect the domestic linkage with the international, it's going to get their attention. There is no question about it. Cirabella contacted unions in Europe and Asia with an idea of using international pressure to help win strikes and organizing campaigns. Cirabella was still developing new approaches to organizing when he died, bitter and angry, in 1993. New strategies and personalities.
In the late 1970s, the corporate campaign was developed as a tool for unions to augment the strike.
The corporate campaign was given name and shape by Ray Rogers, a former student activist whose tactics were derived from the student movement. As Rogers told me, no question Saul Alinsky played a role in my thinking and SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. They understood how you research companies. The basic idea of the corporate campaign was to discover and exploit corporate weaknesses other than those that could be exploited through striking. The corporate campaign required intense research into corporate policies, structure, and leadership. Rogers had his greatest early success helping the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union, ACTWU, to win a contract with the bitterly anti-union J.P. Stevens Company. 1 His main contribution was the realization that unions needed to learn other techniques besides the strike for exerting pressure on companies. 79. Chapter 8 The Culinary Union and the Development of the Comprehensive Campaign. Rogers became controversial within the ranks of organized labor fairly soon after the Stevens campaign. Rogers is charismatic and deeply committed to an egalitarian vision of social justice. His campaigns generally evoked fierce loyalty from rank-and-file workers. But he distrusted and was distrusted by union leaders who questioned both his tactics and his loyalty. By the late 1980s, Rogers had been largely isolated from the labor movement. 2. It was during the late 1980s, in the aftermath of Vinnie Cirabella's failed organizing project, that he adopted a similar, but more flexible and effective, organizing technique, the comprehensive campaign. The development of this new organizing model took place over many years. The first major step occurred in 1981, when Jeff Fiedler, a former student activist and Vietnam combat veteran and then the director of corporate affairs for the Food and Allied Service Trades, FAST, department of the AFL-CIO, developed a plan for the United Food and Commercial Workers, UFCW, and the service employees. International Union, SEIU, to combat Beverly Health Enterprises, a notorious anti-union company. The power of Beverly was such that a strike at an individual unit was almost certain to fail. According to Fiedler, the SEIU and the UFCW won 2/3 of the elections they entered, but only 25% of those ever ended up in contracts.
Fiedler advised simultaneous organizing campaigns and bargaining strikes against Beverly throughout the country. We were trying to get a contract at one of the Beverly homes in D.C., and I said, wait a second, he's got about 1,200 places, creating a problem for them in one home when they had 1,200 was not going to help. But then we recognized that unions win 2 out of 3 nursing home elections. You can use an idiot organizer and win because of the conditions.
And hey, this is made to order. Let's just do it on scale. Put 1,000 organizers on the streets to start. We won every election in Arkansas by 2-1. And we organized. We didn't lose anything in Mississippi, and 8 months into the campaign, the company was talking to us. Beverly was suddenly faced with the obligation to bargain at health facilities all over the country, and the 2 unions involved, The SAU and the UFCW, at Fiedler's suggestion, applied economic pressure on Beverly largely by using non-labor regulatory statutes. They reported health code violations to authorities and in some cases opposed Beverly's applications for licenses. They issued a carefully documented patient care report based on every inspection report for multiple years on every home in a number of states. The report was widely distributed. We gave it to every regulator in the world. And we used it in the certificate hearings, used it in the newspaper, used it all over the place.
It was a very solid piece of work. Fiedler and Fast lawyer Richard McCracken teamed up to instigate shareholder complaints and resolutions against Beverly.
Fiedler noted that at the same time, we fought every one of the company's industrial revenue bonds.
We went through every locale and gathered all the wrongful deaths and neglect cases, this is before real computers, and did a list of everybody suing the company and gave it to everybody else suing the company.
We used political pressure in the certificate of need hearings. You know, every nursing home, when they want to build a new nursing home, you have to have a certificate of need. And they have rules, all right, about what the criteria were, but we would interject the patient care information, which wasn't part of the criteria but became very difficult to ignore, and then you discover during the course of the fight, things like Mississippi, which doesn't like unions, hated the company. The regulators cooperated with us enormously because Beverly was driving up the reimbursement costs. The campaign worked well enough that, 13 months after it began, Beverly settled with the union. As Fiedler explained, we reached an agreement that was sort of a neutrality pledge and a standard contract with wages and benefits to be negotiated locally. The comprehensive campaign, almost by definition, is costly in time and money, and it is risky. Indeed, the SEIU's effort to follow up the Beverly victory with a broad-based campaign failed. As Fiedler recounted, my great disappointment was that it wasn't followed. John Sweeney was president of the SEIU, and after Beverly he misread all the lessons of the campaign, and his next one, which they wanted to do alone, although they talked to me about working with them on it, was Blue Cross Blue Shield. But it was 87 companies, it wasn't one company. It's not the same thing. It's 87 fights, not one. And first of all, he announced it like a big PR move so that everybody could get ready for them. And then it was a clerical campaign. It never came off. 3. The comprehensive campaign can be used against any employer and for both organizing and collective bargaining. But it requires a broad-based attack.
As explained by Jeff Fiedler, it doesn't do any good to have 100% of the people in Marriott Hotel in downtown Washington if that's my only organizing piece when they got 15 more around here.
I mean, why would I fucking do that? What I tell people, you going to have one fight, are you going to have one a year for the next 15 years? That's the way the United States fought the war in Vietnam. As we used to say, once, 15 times. If it's not 100%, it's some rational scale. All of a hotel chain, hotels in a particular city, the key ones in downtown, or whatever. Some critical mass that makes the fight worth doing. It took a while for the SEIU's organizing department to learn how to use the technique effectively, but the SEIU continued to develop it during the 1980s. It is particularly useful for the low-wage workers whom they represent since the union can, through continual pressure over a long period of time, make the campaign more costly to the employer than the gains that the union is seeking. Kirk Adams, the organizing director of the SEIU, explained to me how the technique of expanding costs in strikes and organizing campaigns works.
We've been able to get them to talk to us because we have been in several campaigns, almost foolhardy in how long we've been at it.
We go at it. Employers know that once they engage with us in a stick fight, it just keeps going. They know that it's not something that will go away. They can't wait it out. We sort of stay on them and stay on and stay on them. We have to have that reputation. In 1984, McCracken, at Fiedler's urging, presented a paper at a meeting of Fast lawyers in which he described the advantages of unconventional pressure tactics over the NLRB election process. 4 McCracken pointed out that, as the Beverly campaign showed, unions had available a large number of pressure tactics, most of which had already been used successfully in specific instances. Unions have interfered in the process by which businesses obtain industrial development bonds, by appearing before issuing agencies and questioning whether the bond proceeds will actually be used to create new jobs or save existing ones. Unions have worked with success to deprive companies of government contracts, by presenting evidence to contracting agencies of such things as companies' involvement in financial or corruption scandals, or failure to meet contracting standards such as bonding. Food industry workers have put pressure on their employers by reporting to government authorities building and health code violations. Unions have sought representation on the board of directors of banks by threatening to withdraw union funds and pension funds. During the J.P. Stevens struggle, the same threat was used to force Stevens's directors off of bank boards of directors. What these examples have in common is that the pressure tactics do not depend upon the existence or use of any labor laws. In fact, they do not even have any content specifically related to labor relations. That is, the argument made or violation pointed out is not based in the nature of a company's labor relations, but rather in some other public policy, or in pure power, as in the case of the bank tactics. Point 5. McCracken argued that non-traditional campaign tactics permit unions to bypass labor relations officials and deal with high-level company officials. We have also succumbed to dealing with people who are merely buffers. Corporate labor relations people. Nothing has impressed me more in my work with FAST than how easy it is to leap over the labor relations people and walk right into the throne room. There are two major advantages to unions in dealing with top officials. The most obvious is that the top executives have a greater ability to make concessions. The second has to do with job functions. It is the job of labor relations people today to defeat unions. If they fail, they haven't done their job properly. But the job of the top officials is to keep the enterprise working efficiently to make sure that profits are maintained and customers satisfied. That may require recognizing or dealing with the union if refusal to do so is costly enough. McCracken argued that it would usually be easy for unions to make it costly if the officials refused. There are, for example, many laws regulating company behavior. Every federal, state, territorial, municipal, and even international law, ordinance, rule, or regulation is a potential source of power for us. Most of these laws are under-enforced, many of them ridiculously so. Under-enforcement led to constant illegality. Violation of the law is a norm of business. The more we dig, the more we find. What is instructive about the Beverly Enterprises campaign to those who will study it is that many different laws were used, and many different fronts were opened up against the company. McCracken urged the unions that he represented to begin systematic planning of comprehensive campaigns. 6 In organizing and strikes. 7 He also recommended that they avoid the labor board wherever possible.
During the 1970s he had become disillusioned with the slowness of the board's processes and the inadequacy of its remedies. I swore in 1981 I would never file another NLRB election petition, because at that point I was convinced that you couldn't organize through the NLRB, period. 8. Shortly thereafter, Fiedler and McCracken worked together to support a strike by Here's Culinary Workers Union Local 226 in Las Vegas. The strike grew out of negotiations for a new master agreement between Here and a consortium of Las Vegas hotels. In 1984, as reported by Dorothy Benz, 13 casinos, represented by the Nevada Resort Association, pressed for labor concessions and provoked a strike. 9 Most of the struck hotels quickly brought in replacement workers. They also quickly found an anti-labor judge who issued a very broad injunction against picketers. McCracken later recalled, it specified that there were to be no more than 2 picketers every 35 feet. It also included various vague restrictions on behavior, like not annoying people. 10. The leadership of the culinary was not ready for a mass strike and was not sure how to respond. 11 Fiedler came up with a plan aimed at the Hilton Hotel, which seemed to be leading the opposition. McCracken explained how it worked. One of the ways that we brought a conclusion to the strike was a measure that Jeff and I executed after studying the finances of Hilton, the company that was really leading the strike. We traced their financial chain back to England, and we, with cooperation from one of the English unions, made a big splash at their bank's annual shareholders meeting in Great Britain. Baron Hilton actually publicly said that they decided to settle with us when we got to their bank. And that's something the leadership of the union in Las Vegas at that time really didn't see the importance of. Vinny saw the importance and so did John Wilhelm. The new, more aggressive approach proved valuable in maintaining an agreement with Hilton. But overall, the strike was far from an unmitigated success. 12 According to Wilhelm, the local settlement of that strike was frustrating to the members as well as incomplete and messy. The union was decertified by 6 casinos, 4 other casino hotels which had settled refused to comply with the agreed-upon terms, and the locals' only response was NLRB and court proceedings with, of course, no result. The status of the culinary after these setbacks was shaky at best. Several employers including Harrah's and Boyd Gaming made clear that they were gearing up for battle to decertify the union during the next round of negotiations. In addition, there was the problem of Steve Wynn, who announced plans to build what was to be the largest hotel in the world, the Mirage, and vowed not to sign an agreement with the culinary. The local union, aware that it lacked the strength to take him on, appealed to the international union for help.
Ed Hanley responded by sending a team led by John Wilhelm, whom he appointed Western Regional Director. The team included 3 of Vinnie Cirabella's organizing trainees, D. Taylor, Bill Granfield, and Joe Doherty, and Rich McCracken was enlisted for both legal and strategic advice. Here organizers added to the comprehensive campaign formula, true to the teachings of Cirabella, the intensive use of employee committees. Wilhelm later recalled that the local union was ill-prepared for a major battle. The local was so screwed up. It had not trained rank and filers to be organizers. A lot of people on the staff at the local were from the rank and file, but they had never been trained in an organizing perspective nor in a militant perspective. Wilhelm and his crew set about organizing worker committees. According to Wilhelm, the mobilization of the membership succeeded in diffusing desert campaigns by promising a new rank and file-oriented style of unionism, in contrast to what the workers saw in 1984. D. Taylor, who now heads the culinary, recently recognized the union's continuing debt to Cirabella in this regard. Vinnie always said you have to build up a very good committee in order to win, and you have to use all the tools at your disposal to win. And he was right. McCracken told me that the Wilhelm Group started a research department here, which was not the typical union research department, but actually doing corporate research. All this, coupled with mobilization of the members. So we started doing massive street actions, more high-tech things. So that's where we started calling these things comprehensive campaigns. According to Taylor, who along with Wilhelm led Here's Battle to survive and then to grow in Las Vegas, a comprehensive campaign involves many things. Obviously organizing the workforce is the core, the backbone, but you look at the financial vulnerabilities, you look at the political vulnerabilities, you look at community vulnerabilities, you look at their business plan, what is helpful or not. So you are looking at an entire body of information. Wilhelm coordinated the effort, mixing worker mobilization and research on the structure of the hotels they were attempting to organize. He also added the strategy of demonstrating to the hotels that good relations with the union could be helpful to them. Bill Granfield described the aspects of the campaign. While the organizers, D.
Taylor and myself and the others were working on forming committees. Wilhelm really worked at understanding who the leaders of the gaming industry were at that time in Nevada and how he could deal with them. The gaming industry was very worried about certain federal tax initiatives that were being talked about, and they didn't have a prayer about doing anything about it because they were in 2 states at that time, Nevada and New Jersey. So here's a federal tax thing and they've got a maximum of 4 senators. So John gets together with Ed Hanley. Maybe here could be helpful on this tax question. And that might open the doors to real communications with the industry. And no one else was speaking about that. It emerged that we had a way of both applying pressure and being helpful to the industry. The union's tactics proved successful. Steve Wynn's Golden Nugget Inc. became the first company to settle with the union in 1989. In return, the union offered work rule changes. The union also agreed that it would refrain from economic action against the company's new casinos. The company, in turn, agreed not to oppose unionization in those new casinos and to recognize the union on the basis of a majority of signed authorization cards. The Big Six, an informal grouping of some of the city's biggest corporate gaming establishments, were the next to settle, and a majority of the city's casinos followed. It was at this point that the Las Vegas union leadership recognized that it had developed an entirely new approach to organizing. It was based on labor movement precedents, but it was the union's own elaborate protocol. According to McCracken, in 1989 we decided we would expand the idea of voluntary card check recognition, and it evolved into a pretty elaborate set of ground rules for organizing. The old UFCW model was, and this goes back to the Kroger cases, the contract would be extended to any new facility. That's all it said. There was nothing in that about union organizers' access to the new facility or getting the names and addresses of the employees there. There wasn't even anything about card check. So we took all those things and made them into an elaborate set of ground rules in 1989, which became part of the Las Vegas contract, and it has become the foundation for all our card check neutrality agreements. A major test of the new internal organizing occurred during a 10-month strike at the Horseshoe Hotel. The strike was bitter and involved marches, replacement workers, court injunctions, and acts of civil disobedience. Over 900 workers were arrested during the strike. Joe Doherty, who had primary responsibility for running the strike, was arrested 36 times in the 10 months. According to eyewitnesses, it was not that Doherty was violent but that he refused to be intimidated. He later recalled in an interview with me, "I think it is now illegal, but they used to have this charge called provoking a breach of the peace, so if you were picketing and some scuffle broke out, they could use that to arrest you." Doherty said that he was determined to show that the union leaders could not be intimidated. I think it was more for the membership to see that the union was not going to allow them to get pushed around and would do what was necessary to win. Wilhelm described Doherty's actions as a display of leadership that should be at the top of the annals of labor history. Doherty, like Bill Granfield, credits the union's ultimate victory to the combination of union militancy and its willingness to help the industry stave off new federal taxes. At the same time, John and Vincent and President Hanley demonstrated that while we could be adversaries, we could also be a strong partner in the gaming industry.
The corporations saw that the union could be very powerful, be very militant, but at the same time be a good partner. I think they chose the partnership model, and I think it took both things kind of simultaneously. The Frontier Strike. The Horseshoe Strike was only a minor skirmish compared with the 6-year Frontier Strike, which followed soon after. The strike began in 1991, when the contract between the Frontier Hotel and the union expired and Margaret Ellardy and her sons took over the hotel. Their approach to the union was described in a New Yorker article. They bought the place in 1988, just a few months before its culinary union contract expired. By law, the Ellardys were required to bargain, in good faith, with the union to reach a new settlement, but after months of stalling, the family hired Joel Keller, a notorious union-busting lawyer. Keller, whom the National Labor Relations Board later suspended for a year from handling labor cases before it, no longer represents the Frontier. After a confrontation with the union staged by Keller, the Ellardys unilaterally declared an impasse and imposed their own work rules. Salaries for new employees were drastically reduced, workers were fired without cause, seniority rules were essentially abandoned. Women who had worked days suddenly found themselves on the graveyard shift. A 40-hour workweek, on which paid vacations and holidays depended, was no longer guaranteed. 13. Almost immediately after the strike began, the hotel management permanently replaced the strikers. This was the beginning of one of the longest strikes in labor history. The workers stood fast. In a remarkable display of solidarity, not a single worker crossed the picket line despite the anguish of watching for more than 6 years, day after day, as replacement workers and customers entered the hotel. The Frontier workers withstood hours of boredom, the taunts of anti-union hecklers, physical attacks, and the inevitable moments of doubt about the outcome. They received support from their union brothers and sisters in Las Vegas, who voted to double their dues to give them financial support. Unions from around the country came to Las Vegas to show support. The strike was the subject of an excellent film, 14, which pointed out, among other things, that 7 languages were spoken on the picket line. 15. Tom Snyder, the newly appointed political director of HERE, joined the staff just as the strike was ending. He told me that was struck by the diversity of the strike's leadership. I mean, there the leadership was white, black, and brown on that strike, on the picket line, and at every level. In an attempt to obtain political support, the union undertook a campaign to elect Maggie Carlton, one of its shop stewards, to the state senate. She won and was able to use her position to pressure the governor to try to mediate the dispute. When the governor failed to get a settlement, he appointed a fact finder, who reported that the Ellardys had bargained in bad faith.
Union investigators were able to discover a variety of likely illegal behavior by the Ellardys, which put their casino license in jeopardy.
The continued pressure finally forced the Ellardys to sell to a new owner, who was eager for a good relationship with the culinary.
Under the new, quickly negotiated contract, all strikers were rewarded with substantial raises and seniority credit for their time on strike, something rarely achieved in strike settlements.
According to Wilhelm, the battle-tested Frontier strikers provided the culinary with a new generation of leaders.
Many key leaders of our union in Las Vegas emerged from the early struggles, including Gioconda Arguello Klein, an immigrant from Nicaragua who was a room cleaner, later a member of the Frontier strike team, now the president, the number 2 position in Local 226. Ted Papageorge, a horseshoe striker who was a bartender, now the internal staff director of Local 226 and clearly a key leader for the future. Jim Bonaventure, a staff member at the local when we got there, a former showroom waiter, now the head of the Local 226 grievance department. Chris Walker, female Chris, a former cocktail server at the Dunes who was on the original team that organized and serviced the Mirage Hotel when it opened in 1989, a critical turning point for the rebuilding, now the staff director of Local 54 in Atlantic City, leading the rebuilding of that union and a key leader of the successful 2004 casino strike in that city, and many others, including several Frontier strikers who now lead organizing in Las Vegas. After crediting the strikers for their great display of courage, Wilhelm gave credit to the staff. Joe Doherty ran the horseshoe strike. He was one of the young organizers Vinnie hired for the 1985 organizing projects.
and was part of the original team that came to Las Vegas with D. Taylor in 1987. Our strategic research department, which is now a crown jewel of our union and of the labor movement, began in Las Vegas when President Hanley let me hire Mark Atkinson. Another key organizer who came to Las Vegas in January 1987 with D and me was Kevin Klein, also one of Vinny's 1985 hires, who is now the organizing director for our union nationally in gaming under D's direction.
Glenn Arnaudo, who came to our union from the United Electrical Workers in the 1980s, was the first local 226 political director, and laid the foundation for what is today an extraordinary rank-and-file driven political program, including among other things the election of a shop steward, Maggie Carlton,
to the Nevada State Senate, where she still serves, and has become one of the most influential state legislators, and since the Nevada legislature is part-time, she also still works at Treasure Island as a coffee shop food server. While the Frontier strike was in progress, the culinary became involved in another major dispute. In 1993 MGM opened the MGM Grand Hotel and Casino. MGM signaled its intention to remain non-union by hiring Robert Maxey as its president and CEO. According to a knowledgeable commentator, Maxey had a history of antagonism to the union. He was a man on a crusade, a jihad against the union, at the MGM.16. The union responded to the announcement of Maxey's first moves with all the techniques suggested by McCracken, who was one of the chief strategists involved in the struggle. The union produced literature that prominently highlighted operating losses in the millions at 3 separate casinos which Maxey had previously headed. The report was circulated among stockholders, potential investors, lenders. The union also intervened in the MGM's efforts to expand. The union used its institutional relationships with central labor councils, state federations and other union bodies to help mount opposition to MGM expansion. Maxey resigned in June of 1995. J. Terrence Lanny, a former CEO of the unionized Caesars Palace, became the new chairman, and within months the MGM and Culinary had negotiated a card check agreement that ended the labor war. The company returned to profitability in 1996.17. Thereafter, the union continued to organize successfully. Today, all but one casino hotel on the Strip is unionized. The union's continued success in Las Vegas was in large part the result of its victories in battle, but it was also facilitated by the union's willingness to work cooperatively with organized hotels. The Culinary offered employers who signed on support in dealing with government regulations and a way of obtaining qualified workers through the union's Culinary Training Institute. The institute, union-run and employer-funded, is modeled on the hiring hall and training programs used by building trades unions. It offers workers a chance to learn both basic hotel jobs and new skills. It teaches every type of hospitality job, from room attendant to chef. Its teachers come from the industry. It is free to employees of contributing employers and to those out of work. As D. Taylor explained, based on your economic status, it charges you or you get basically grants. The program works well for both employers and workers. It is an important part of the union's success. According to Taylor, we have made it a priority. Value Plus. You are going to pay our folks more, but you are going to get a better quality. 18 as a result of the institute, according to D. Taylor, we, the union, are now the largest movers of welfare to work in Las Vegas. The Culinary is today one of the largest and most powerful local unions in the country and a major political force in Las Vegas. It helps train hotel workers, and it provides them with good wages and benefits. Its success was reported by Stephen Greenhouse of the New York Times. Culinary Local 226, also called the Culinary, the city's largest labor union, an unusual, and unusually successful, union, has done a spectacular job catapulting thousands of dishwashers, hotel maids and other unskilled workers into the middle class. In most other cities, these workers live near the poverty line. But thanks in large part to the Culinary, in Las Vegas these workers often own homes and have Rolls-Royce health coverage, a solid pension plan, and 3 weeks of vacation a year. The Culinary's extraordinary success at delivering for its 48,000 members beckons newcomers from far and wide. By many measures, the Culinary is the nation's most successful union local. Its membership has nearly tripled from 18,000 in the late 1980s, even as the rest of the labor movement has shrunk. The Culinary is such a force that 1 in 10 people here is covered by its health plan, and more than 90% of the hotel workers on the Strip belong to the union. The union is also unusual because it is a rainbow coalition, 65% non-white and 70% female. It includes immigrants from Central America, refugees from the Balkan Wars, and blacks from the Deep South. 19. Taylor, who is now the head of both the Culinary and Unite Here's gaming division, believes that a great many factors account for the union's success. First and foremost, we had John guide us, and there's no better strategic mind. I know of than John Wilhelm. And he taught us how to be strategic thinkers. We spend an enormous amount of time on staff development. We build very big committees. We have a very good research department. We use political power in order to help us organize. We obviously have shown to the industry that when we get in a fight, we're in there for the long haul. The frontier strike was key to that. But we also devote an enormous amount of resources to organizing. I mean, we spend a lot of money on organizing. And also we view our contracts as just another tool to organize new members, so it's a lot of different things. The success of the culinary offers many lessons to the labor movement, most of which have not yet been adequately understood. First, it is important to realize that the union's far from inevitable victory was not simply a function of the special nature of Las Vegas. The culinary was on the verge of being ren. Dered impotent when John Wilhelm arrived along with D. Taylor, Bill Granfield, Rich McCracken, Joe Doherty, and other activists. Their ultimate success is a reminder of the importance of cohesive leadership and mobilization of the union rank and file. For all its success, the culinary has not been able to organize every casino or gambling hotel in Las Vegas. Its single-strip failure is the Venetian, owned by right-wing billionaire Sheldon Adelson. Adelson has battled the union in a variety of forums. One of his main techniques has been to match or exceed union wages and benefits. The culinary has also failed to organize the station casinos, which are casinos located in local Las Vegas neighborhoods, neither on the Strip nor downtown. According to Wilhelm, they have been wildly successful. They have thus far held off the union, according to Wilhelm, by running an extreme carrot anti-union program. They went to some lengths to match our union wages. They went to some lengths to give at least a cosmetic appearance of matching our health plan and our pension. They ran citizenship programs for non-citizen workers. They had a very sophisticated carrot-style anti-union program. These two failures indicate that a combination of determined ownership and basically satisfied workers can resist comprehensive campaigns. 92. While here's young leaders and organizers were changing the focus and tactics of the union, its leadership and many of its locals were being investigated by the President's Commission on Organized Crime, which in 1986 issued a report critical of the union's top leadership and its Chicago locals. For 40 years Joseph Iupa, now the underboss of the Chicago outfit, and boss Tony Accardo wielded power in the Chicago area locals and the HEREIU Joint Executive Board. Their actions took on national proportions when Edward Hanley, who began his career in Local 450 as a business agent in 1957, was elected to the HEREIU presidency in 1973.
According to the Senate report, the reign of Hanley has been surrounded by allegations of organized crime's influence in the choice of international union organizers, operation of benefit funds, and conduct of union affairs.
Since Hanley took office in 1973, union assets dropped from $21.4 million to less than $14 million in 1982. Nearly $6 million of this money went into 3 loans executed with private developers, one of whom was Morris Schenker, an associate of the late Kansas City organized crime leader Nicholas Savella. Chapter 9 From Hanley to Wilhelm. The subcommittee found that the union's assets have been used to enrich the top officers of HEREIU's hierarchy.
Base salaries augmented by expense accounts and allowances, lifetime employment contracts, and increased expenditures of tangible items have resulted in expenditures for HEREIU officers skyrocketing from $229,051 in fiscal year 1973 to $1,689,370 in fiscal year 1983.
Former HEREIU General Secretary Treasurer John Gibson was found guilty in May 1980 of misusing the union's airplane and of conspiring to embezzle union funds.
Gibson received concurrent 4-month sentences, which he served in 1983, while receiving his lifetime contract checks from the union.
The list of employees and organizers hired after Hanley became HEREIU president includes organized crime associates and numerous patronage jobs. Most troubling to the subcommittee was the unprecedented degree to which Hanley has been able to centralize authority within HEREIU and to control local chapters through the use of mergers, trusteeships, and personnel transfers, an action which mocks the goals of local autonomy and members' rights. 1. The report was followed by a series of civil suits by the Department of Justice and federal prosecutors under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. In December 1990, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of New Jersey filed a civil RICO suit against Hanley, Philadelphia. Local 54, and officials of the Local. 2 under a consent decree, various officials and former officials were ousted from the union and a court-appointed monitor was installed. 5 years later, in September 1995, the Department of Justice brought a civil RICO suit against the International Union alleging a long history of mob control. The parties entered into a previously negotiated consent decree, which resulted in the appointment of the former federal prosecutor Kurt Muhlenberg as monitor. He had broad powers, including the ability to appoint or discharge employees and to reject both candidates for office and collective bargaining agreements. The consent decree also directed the International Union's General Executive Board to create a public review board and to adopt an ethical practices code, which were approved at the International Union's convention in 1996 and adopted as part of its constitution, effective September 9, 1996.3 at the convention. Hanley was re-elected president and John Wilhelm was elected General Secretary-Treasurer, the number 2 position in the Union. With cooperation from the Union, Muhlenberg started a major review of Here's operations. In February 1998, Hanley stepped down as president. His resignation was part of a deal whereby further investigation was halted and he was guaranteed his retirement salary of $350,000 per year. At the same time, his son Tom Hanley, the director of organizing, agreed to resign for 1 year. In exchange for these actions, it was agreed that neither father nor son would be indicted. In May 1998, the Union's General Executive Board selected Wilhelm to succeed Hanley as president, a decision ratified at the Union's 2001 convention. In August 1998, roughly 3 years after his initial appointment, Muhlenberg issued his final report. It contains a powerful indictment of the Union's business practices, its lack of set procedures, its lack of audits and controls, its lack of membership involvement. It is particularly scathing in its discussion of the organizing department under Ed Hanley's son Tom, who had succeeded Vinnie Cirabella. In 1995, the Teamsters had a membership of 1,437,000 served by 35 international organizers. In a comparable period, 1994-1995, the International Union had a membership of 243,467 served by 105 international organizers. Thus the International Union, with a membership of only 17% of that of the Teamsters, had 3 times as many organizers. The fact is that most of the international organizers are not engaged in organizing activities. 4. Muhlenberg also charged the organizing department with carelessness with the members' money, a constant theme of the report. While salaries of most employees seemed to be very generous, there were no uniform standards for selection of appointees, no uniform compensation standards, no performance review process, and no established criteria for promotion or pay increases. Muhlenberg's report was particularly pointed in its discussion of credit card abuses, which can be summed up as large expenditures with little or no backup.
Personal expenses are placed on union credit cards, including personal meal and beverage expenses. He was equally displeased with the union's policies of leasing automobiles for its staff, despite the fact that the International Union's outlay for automobile-related expenses are well over $500,000 per year. There is no budget for vehicle leases and related costs, nor are there any administrative controls to provide management with timely information pertinent to controlling costs throughout the fiscal year.
Another area of great expenditure for little result was in the hiring and payment of consultants. The Monitor detailed a series of questionable expenses. For example, Paul Burke, a retired actor and neighbor of Mr. Hanley's in Palm Springs, California, has been a consultant since 1980. He was paid $25,000 per year, received health insurance and a union-leased Cadillac Seville. Mr. Burke's job was to provide a celebrity presence to the International Union's General Executive Board and fund meetings. His contract was terminated in February 1997 after an inquiry by my office. He now receives a $600 monthly pension from the union. There are no reports of Mr. Burke's activities. The Monitor was also critical of the way the union used its private airplane. Although he found that it was not used to ferry organized crime figures, it was frequently sent from Washington, D.C., to pick up President Hanley in Chicago and fly him to Washington. The cost was enormous. The Monitor was critical of the president's unlimited authority to hire, promote, and set salaries. The report also contains the Monitor's conclusion with respect to some 20 locals that were investigated. None were found blameless, and some reviews resulted in disciplinary charges. The Monitor reported that 5 local unions have been placed in trusteeship at my request. These trusteeships were imposed in order to restore democracy to the local unions following charges being filed against the officers for violations, such as association with organized crime figures, embezzlement, and filing false reports with the U.S. Department of Labor, etc. He made a series of recommendations, 47 in all, for correcting the union's operations. 5. What the Monitor did not report was criminal or mob activity at the international level. He concluded, there was no credible evidence to support any finding that Mr. Hanley was associated with or indeed controlled by organized crime. His only recommendation in that regard was that the International Union carefully monitor the situation. The fact that the final report did not find criminal influence and that it left Here's election procedures intact was worrisome to some labor reformers. Whether HEREIU has been purged of LCN, La Cosa Nostra, influence is an open question, according to Professor James Jacobs, who was skeptical of Muhlenberg's report. The trusteeship in the HEREIU case is by far the least intensive and comprehensive of those imposed on the 4 international unions. Compared to the others, that trusteeship was brief in duration, scantily staffed, and minimally intrusive. It is hard to believe that the relatively minimalist effort in the HEREIU case could have been sufficient, assuming, of course, some rough parity in the extent of racketeering. Nevertheless, there are several important achievements. Ed Hanley was removed from office. The new president has better credentials than the presidents of the other 3 international unions, but even he has not repudiated the old regime. Investigations of labor racketeering in HEREIU have more or less ceased. We do not know whether HEREIU has been substantially liberated. If so, it is crucial to determine how this could have been accomplished with such a comparatively inexpensive and short-term effort. 6. Jacobs's discussion raises several questions. First, what is his basis for assuming some rough parity in the extent of racketeering, since the Monitor, a former prosecutor operating with the support of both the Department of Justice and the Department of Labor, did not find evidence of mob infiltration or racketeering at the international level? But what of Hanley and the conclusion of the President's Commission on Organized Crime that he was brought to power with the help of Tony Accardo and Joey Aiuppa? What of Hanley's regular use of the Fifth Amendment? His willingness to step down rather than face the likelihood of indictment? Jacobs seems to have no doubt that Hanley was mob-connected during his presidency, although Jacobs gives no evidence. Jacobs considers Wilhelm's refusal to disavow Hanley as a basis for doubting Wilhelm's devotion to reform. He points out that Wilhelm's position goes beyond refusal to condemn, darkly noting that, in 1999 Wilhelm named the
HERE International Headquarters building in Washington, D.C., for Edward
Hanley. Wilhelm has remained steadfast and unrepentant in his support of Hanley's basic honesty and devotion to the Union.
He goes beyond that and credits Hanley with playing a key role in the transformation of the Union. 7. He points out that it was Hanley who first recognized Vinnie Cirabella's contribution to the Union and who gave full support to the Yale organizing drive. I mean, he literally said first to Vinnie and then me, as many of the places as you guys can staff and improve, go for it. It was Hanley who brought Cirabella to the West Coast in the late 1970s, when political turmoil threatened to destroy the Union. It is Hanley whom Wilhelm credits with the transformation of the culinary. Somebody else could not have done it. The idea of sending D. Taylor and me and a squad of similar people to Las Vegas, of all places, was regarded as complete apostasy in our union, and a different kind of a leader never could have got away with it. I liken it to Nixon going to China, you know. They used to also say it took a conservative Republican to go to China because a Democrat would have been skewered had he done it. I have the same point of view of Edward Hanley. He was a bartender's bartender. He was out of the traditional heart of our old union. Had I become president of our union, or had Vinnie become president of our union in 1973, when Edward became president, we would have failed, in my opinion, because we would have had too many internal and political obstacles in our way. He was able to do these things partly because he was extremely smart, but partly because he was unassailable by the traditional wing of the union. Wilhelm agrees that there was a corruption problem in the union when he became president, although he does not blame Hanley. There's no question that there were a number of local unions that were either corrupt or mob-influenced or both. But bear in mind, that was a time when there was a very high degree of local autonomy. He also somewhat reluctantly acknowledges that Hanley's spending practices were unnecessarily lavish, although he insists that they were not out of line by the standards of the time. I think it would be fair to say of the Hanley administration that he spent money on some things that I wouldn't have spent money on, but he was certainly not out of sync with the labor movement of that era. Just by way of illustration, the union owned an airplane under Edward's administration, and I sold it literally on my first day in office. Now, having said that, he was hardly alone. There was a bunch of unions in those days that had airplanes. So I would say that his administration spent some money on things that I would not have spent it on and didn't spend it on when I became president. I don't think those were in the category of outrageous, and I think they were very consistent with the standards of a lot of the labor movement at that time. Wilhelm's comment is as much an indictment of the standards of the labor movement at the time as it is a defense of Hanley. Hanley's lavish use of the members' money was not lost on activist rank and file members. As one who asked not to be quoted told me,
From everything that we understood at the time, there was tons and tons of money. That's our dues money. Spent on all sorts of hangers-on, gross mismanagement of our money. I haven't read his full report, but my expectation is that the Monitor's report is a cleaned-up version of what Hanley was about. When I showed up here, there was a reporter whose name I don't remember off the top of my head, but he was running a series of articles about Belardi and Hanley, and one of the symbols of Belardi was some diamond-encrusted gavel that Hanley had presented to Belardi. It just felt like that's what they're spending our money on, diamond-encrusted gavels. And I remember the airplanes were a big thing that people always talked about. Despite his admiration for Hanley, Wilhelm took steps to make sure that his lavish spending was not repeated. Local 1 had spending practices I would not have approved of and that we changed after we trusteed Local 1 in 1999 and sent Henry Tamarin there as the trustee. But there was no evidence of any kind of any corruption there. Despite Hanley's loose ways with money, Wilhelm's regard for him is shared by every progressive leader of the union I have interviewed. Paul Clifford, the Yale-educated architect's son from Canada, and now head of the Toronto local, worked with Hanley when he was dispatched to Chicago to work on the organizing drive led by Cirabella. It was not an easy task to accommodate the new, idealistic organizers with the old line union staff. As Clifford told me, at the level of the staff of Local 1 and the organizers, it was kind of oil and water. I think he was really dedicated to seeing the union change and both incur aging our whole group and also kind of greasing the wheels and making room for all of us. Clifford's relationship with Hanley illustrates Hanley's remarkable willingness to accommodate the major changes that were taking place in the union through the efforts of Wilhelm and his new breed of organizers, as the following story, told to me by Clifford, about a longtime major goal, organizing the Marriott, reveals. There was a meeting where host Marriott had wanted to meet with me and Hanley, or wanted to meet with Hanley, and he brought me to the meeting. So we had a meeting in a hotel in Chicago, and host Marriott said, "Look, we'll recognize the union, but we actually want to bargain the contract like right now." And so Hanley looked at me and said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Can I speak with you?" So privately, I said, "Look, Edward, I think it's great we are getting recognized, but through the organizing I promised workers that we'd have a rank and file negotiation committee. The union is their voice, you know." And Hanley's like, "Paul, this is the Marriott. Can you believe we just beat Marriott? Come on, we can get it done right now." And I said, "I'm sorry, Edward, I can't do it. I can't do that as an organizer. I can't do that, I promised them, I gave them my word." He kind of takes a big sigh and, "Okay, we'll go through the bargaining process." You know, it's remarkable. And the reason he did that was that he knew what I had promised and also what I had put into it and didn't want to crush my spirit. This story illustrates here in transition. A young, committed organizer takes on the president of the International Union to show support for rank and file power. The president supports him, risking an important union goal. There are not many unions in which young organizers would be willing to take on the president in support of the rank and file, and not many in which the president would listen and be swayed. What would surprise those who knew him in his early, workers need to hate the boss days is that Carl Lachow, an international vice president of the union, thinks of Hanley, along with Vinnie and John, as a mentor who taught him the value of cooperating with management in the interests of the workers. As Lachow told me, Ed Hanley, you know, I say surprisingly, was very instrumental. He came out of a different culture than either Vinnie or, certainly John, and his approach to stuff was initially very perplexing to me. But he was actually over a course of 10 or 15 years very, very helpful in showing us how to gain by being cooperative as well as by being opposy. Tional. He introduced some tools to us. Look guys, there are a number of ways of skinning a cat and you know these people we're dealing with are very powerful. It may be worthwhile not only to have some struggle but also to have some cooperation. None of my informants in the union was in a position to say whether Hanley had ever been mob-connected, but Clifford made clear to me that he never saw signs of it. I was in Chicago quite a bit. I've no reason to think anything other than good things about Ed Hanley. Sherry Chiesa, now Unite Here's secretary-treasurer, believes that those aspects of Hanley's career that made him distrusted by labor reformers also permitted him to initiate the most thorough reforms in the union's history. As she told me, Edward was brilliant because he saw that change needed to happen but he knew that only he could carry it out, 'cause the old guard trusted him. Hanley played a similar role in the transition of the Los Angeles Local 11 from a bastion of Anglo domination to a center of Hispanic pride. Maria Elena Durazo, now the leader of the Los Angeles County Federation of Labor and a major force in the battle for immigrant workers' rights, remains a staunch defender. She recalls that, among other things, Hanley provided money to help process citizenship and green card applications under the Immigration Reform and Control Act. The International gave us $100,000 to do amnesty processing. And it was Hanley who gave us the $100,000, so we hired a team of paralegals and lawyers. Professor Jacobs expressed concern about the softness of the Monitor's recommendations. However, it is clear from a report that Muhlenberg had faith in the ability of John Wilhelm to rectify the abuses that the Monitor uncovered. For example, a major criticism by the Monitor had to do with the haphazard nature of the Union's operating style. Muhlenberg wrote in his final report, "Interviews of officials, employees, and some consultants confirmed that the International Union has traditionally operated without some absolute basics. There is no budget, no organization chart, no job description for employees, and no policy manual." But he pointed out that General President Wilhelm has implemented a computer accounting program which will be the basis of a HEREIU budget. He hopes that all departments of the HEREIU will be operating on a budget within a year or two.
He, in his capacity as Secretary-Treasurer, took the initiative to implement a budget procedure for the International
Union's overall operations. The Monitor also pointed out that although Tom Hanley was the director of organization, in fact, the most significant increase in membership for the International Union in decades has come from Orga. Nizing Drives in Las Vegas, Nevada, directed by John Wilhelm. While Mr. Wilhelm's activities could be characterized as those of a local union, their size and scope argue that they be considered in a national context. 8. The Monitor's trust in Wilhelm has turned out to be well deserved. It is notable that, despite his fondness for Hanley, shortly after becoming president, Wilhelm put Local 1 in trusteeship. The person he appointed was his old friend, Union militant Henry Tamarin, who had been hired by Vinnie Cirabella in 1973 for Local 217. When the Union struck the Congress Hotel, Tamarin mobilized the rank and file, many of whom believe that the local has been revitalized under Tamarin. According to Ricky Baldwin, the contrast between here Local 1 of today and the same local of a few short years ago could not be starker.
Corrupt leadership and a knack for inactivity characterized the local for years. It was like the Union was non-existent, says Sharon Williams, a phone operator at the Congress Hotel. But after trusteeship, a reformer named Henry Tamarin became president, and the local reversed course. After Henry came, says Williams, it was like, this is about you guys. We're here for you. Now it's our union. 9. That the Union has remained vigilant with regard to issues of corruption is revealed in its treatment of a case in Florida involving the misuse of Union funds. A theft in the 4 figures might not seem worth a year-long investigation. But, Unite Here is a union unlikely to leave things to chance, especially given its recent history of federal supervision. On May 1, the Union's Ethics Board took disciplinary action against 2 top officials of Local 355, representing 2,700 hotel, restaurant and catering workers in the Miami Ft. Lauderdale area, Jorge Santiesteban and Andre J. Balash, respectively. The local's president and secretary-treasurer, were forced out of their positions after a Unite Here internal probe concluded the pair had diverted union funds toward personal expenses, among other violations. The New York City-based International Union also recommended placing the local under trusteeship. Santiesteban and Balash charged the review board, each misused between $3,000 and $4,000 in union funds for meals and hotel stays. Additionally, Balash knowingly associated with Rocco J. Panero, who had been barred from contact with union officials as part of a 1992 consent decree that settled a racketeering charge against a Here local in New York. In the wake of the probe, Santiesteban resigned from his post, while Balash agreed to a 2-year ban on holding union office. Unite Here named William Granfield, president of New York City's powerful Local 100, as trustee of Local 355 for an indefinite period. 10.